Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. My attention was glued to the far end of the corridor, where the shadows pooled darker than they should beneath the flickering light. The air seemed to ripple, though the evening remained eerily still. Each minute stretched out, taut with expectation, yet nothing moved within that inky void. A creak sounded low and brief, but my eyes could not pin it down. Then came the shift of faint echo, a footfall perhaps, from nowhere and everywhere at once. And in that suspended breath, I sensed the presence just out of sight, pressing inward. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light, and I had to remember if I ever heard the door open. The building had been empty when I arrived, I was certain of that. The security guard had walked me through the lobby, his keys jingling against his belt with each step. He'd mentioned the cleaning crew had finished hours before, and the offices on this floor stayed locked after business hours. Yet here I stood, my back pressed against the cool metal of the elevator doors, watching shadows that moved without wind, listening to sounds that had no source. I had come here for the files, the ones she'd mentioned during our last conversation, her voice carrying that particular strain I'd learned to recognize. The kind that meant she'd found something she shouldn't have. The kind that made her glance over her shoulder, even in crowded rooms. The manila envelope in my jacket pocket felt heavier now, though it contained only a single key and a handwritten note with the office number. Her handwriting, angular and rushed. The same hand that had signed birthday cards and grocery lists, and according to the police report, a resignation letter that no one had expected. The fluorescent bulb above me stuttered again, casting the corridor in alternating pools of harsh white and deep shadow. I counted my breaths, trying to anchor myself to something measurable, something real. 1, 2, 3. The counting helped, usually. It was a technique I'd learned during those sessions after her disappearance, when sleep became elusive and every phone ring sent my heart racing. But the presence lingered. I forced myself forward, each footstep echoing against the polished floor. The office doors lined both sides of the corridor, their frosted glass panels dark and impenetrable. Most bore the names of law firms and consulting agencies, the kind of businesses that dealt in paper and promises. Her office had been near the end, according to the note. The one with the corner window that she'd mentioned during our phone calls, how she could see the park from her desk on clear afternoons. The key turned smoothly in the lock, too smoothly for an office that had supposedly been sealed for weeks. Inside, the air carried the scent of coffee grounds and something else, something floral and faint. Her perfume, perhaps, though that seemed impossible. The cleaning crew would have eliminated such traces. The police investigation would have disturbed any lingering atmosphere. Yet there it was, unmistakable and unsettling. The desk sat positioned exactly as she'd described, angled to catch the natural light from the window. Papers remained scattered across its surface, not the organized chaos of someone preparing to leave, but the active disorder of ongoing work. A coffee mug sat near the computer monitor, a thin ring of brown residue marking where liquid had evaporated. The calendar showed appointments extending weeks into the future, meetings that would never happen. I opened the desk drawers systematically, searching for whatever she'd wanted me to find. The top drawer contained the usual detritus of office life, pens, paper clips, breath mints. The second held files arranged alphabetically, client names and case numbers that meant nothing to me. But the bottom drawer stuck, its contents shifted and compressed as though someone had searched through them hastily. Inside, beneath a stack of legal pads, I found the photographs. They were surveillance images, grainy and taken from a distance. The subjects moved through what appeared to be a parking garage, their faces partially obscured by shadows and poor lighting, but I recognized the figure in the center frame. The same height, the same purposeful stride, the same way of holding her shoulders when she felt observed. It was her. The timestamp showed they were taken weeks before her disappearance, during hours when she should have been home, during evenings when she told me she was working late at the office. I studied each image, searching for context, for explanation. In several frames, she appeared to be speaking with someone just outside the camera's range. Her posture suggested tension, her hands gesturing in the animated way that meant she was arguing a point. I spread the photographs across the desk, arranging them chronologically. They told a story, but not one I could fully decipher. Meeting after meeting in the same location, her expression growing more strained with each encounter. In the final image, she was walking away, her head turned back toward the camera as though she'd sensed its presence. The sound came again, that same soft creak I'd heard in the corridor. This time it seemed to originate from the outer office, beyond the frosted glass door. I gathered the photographs quickly, slipping them into my jacket alongside the key and note. The floral scent had grown stronger, no longer faint but present enough to make me question my earlier assumptions about the cleaning crew and their thoroughness. I switched off the desk lamp and moved toward the window, using the ambient light from the street below to navigate. The park spread out beneath me, its paths winding between patches of darkness where the streetlights failed to penetrate. She'd mentioned feeding the ducks there during lunch breaks, how they'd learned to recognize her approach and would paddle eagerly toward the shore. The ducks were there now, visible as pale shapes drifting across the pond's surface. But it was well past their usual feeding schedule, well past the hour when park visitors typically lingered. Their presence felt deliberate, as though they too were waiting for something that might never come. Behind me, the office door opened with a whisper of displaced air. I didn't turn immediately. Instead, I watched the reflection in the window glass, searching for movement, for the shape of whoever had entered. But the reflection showed only darkness, only the familiar outline of furniture and the pale rectangle of the doorway. No figure, no intruder, just the persistent sense that the space behind me was no longer empty. When I finally turned, the office appeared exactly as I'd left it. The desk drawers remained closed, the chair positioned at the same angle, yet something had changed. The air moved differently, carrying new scents, new tensions. The coffee mug had shifted slightly, its handle now pointing toward the door rather than the window. I approached the desk cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting. The mug was cold to the touch, its contents long since consumed or evaporated, but the repositioning was unmistakable. Someone had been here, had touched this object, had moved through this space while I stood distracted at the window. The realization should have frightened me, should have sent me rushing toward the exit, toward the safety of the lobby and the security guard's presence. Instead, I felt a strange calm descending, the kind that comes with finally understanding that the thing you've been avoiding has found you anyway. I sat in her chair, letting my hands rest on the desk's surface. The wood was warm beneath my palms, warmer than it should have been in an empty office with the heating system set to its overnight schedule. I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct her final days here, the routine she'd followed, the conversations she'd had, the decisions that had led to those surveillance photographs. She'd been investigating something. That much was clear from the images, from the secretive nature of the meetings, from the tension visible in her posture. But investigating what and for whom? The files in her desk revealed nothing beyond routine legal work, contracts and depositions, and the mundane machinery of civil litigation. The answer, when it came, arrived not as revelation, but as memory. I remembered a conversation from months earlier, her voice tight with frustration as she described a case that wasn't progressing as expected. Witnesses who changed their stories, evidence that disappeared from court filings, opposing counsel who seemed to know her strategies before she'd fully formed them herself. She'd suspected someone was feeding information to the other side, but couldn't identify the source. The surveillance photographs took on new meaning, not evidence of wrongdoing on her part, but documentation of her investigation into the leak. She'd been following someone, gathering proof of their betrayal, building a case that would expose the corruption within her own firm. But if that were true, then her disappearance wasn't random, wasn't the result of personal crisis or voluntary departure. It was silencing, permanent and deliberate. I opened my eyes and found the office transformed once again. Not physically, the furniture remained in place, the shadows fell at the same angles, but atmospherically. The space felt occupied now, crowded with invisible presences and unspoken truths. The floral scent had intensified, competing with new odors, leather and aftershave, and something metallic that made my mouth taste of copper. The photographs in my jacket seemed to pulse with their own heat, evidence that someone had killed to suppress, evidence that made me complicit in whatever game was being played here. I understood now why she'd chosen to meet in parking garages, why she'd glanced over her shoulder, why her handwriting had grown increasingly erratic in those final weeks. She'd known they were watching. The question that remained was whether they knew about me. I stood slowly, testing the weight of each movement, the sound of each breath. The office remained silent, but it was the silence of held breath rather than emptiness. Someone was listening, evaluating, deciding how much I discovered and what that discovery might cost. I moved toward the door, my hand reaching for the light switch out of habit, but I stopped before making contact. Leaving the office as I'd found it seemed important now, maintaining the fiction that my visit had been brief and unproductive, that I'd found nothing worth pursuing. The corridor stretched before me, its shadows deeper than when I'd arrived. The flickering fluorescent had finally failed completely, leaving only the pale glow from the emergency exit signs to guide my way. My footsteps echoed differently now, as though the space itself had expanded, grown longer and more labyrinthine. Behind me I heard the soft click of a door closing, but when I turned, the corridor appeared empty, all office doors sealed and dark. The sound could have come from anywhere, from any of the dozen businesses that lined this floor, or from none of them. Sound played tricks in buildings like this, traveling through ventilation systems and hollow walls, emerging in unexpected places with distorted timing. The elevator seemed farther away than I remembered, its call button glowing like a distant star. I pressed it and listened to the mechanical groaning as the car rose through the building's shaft. The wait felt interminable, each second expanding to accommodate new doubts, new fears, new possibilities I didn't want to consider. When the doors finally opened, the elevator wasn't empty. The security guard stood inside, his uniform rumpled and his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised to see me, didn't ask what I'd been doing on a floor that should have been deserted. Instead, he stepped aside to make room, his keys jangling softly against his belt. We descended in silence, the floors ticking past on the digital display. I studied his reflection in the polished metal doors, searching for signs of complicity, for evidence that my presence here hadn't been as secret as I'd believed. but his face revealed nothing beyond professional indifference, the blank expression of someone accustomed to working nights and asking few questions. The lobby felt cavernous after the intimate confines of her office, its marble floors stretching toward glass doors that reflected the street lights beyond. The guard resumed his position behind the security desk, his attention already shifting to a bank of monitors that showed empty corridors and darkened offices. I signed out in the visitor log, noting the time with mechanical precision. My signature looked foreign to me, the letters slightly distorted as though written by someone else's hand. The guard glanced at it briefly, then filed the clipboard beneath his desk without comment. Outside, the street seemed brighter than it should have been, the sodium lights casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. I walked quickly, not toward my car but deeper into the downtown district, where late-night pedestrians and the occasional taxi provided anonymity and witness. The photographs in my jacket felt radioactive, dangerous to possess but impossible to abandon. I found an all-night diner several blocks away, its windows fogged with condensation and filled with the kind of customers who didn't ask questions about why someone might need coffee in solitude at such an hour. I chose a booth in the back, facing the door, and spread the surveillance images across the table's scratched surface. Under the diner's harsh fluorescent lighting, the photographs revealed details I'd missed in the office. The parking garage wasn't random. I recognized it now as the structure beneath the courthouse, the place where lawyers and judges and court officials parked during business hours. The meetings she documented weren't clandestine encounters with criminals or conspirators, but conversations with colleagues, with people she'd trusted. One image showed her speaking with a figure whose face remained obscured, but whose stance and clothing suggested authority. A senior partner, perhaps, or someone from the prosecutor's office. Another captured her examining documents, her expression intense with concentration. In a third, she appeared to be photographing something herself, her phone raised toward whatever lay beyond the camera's frame. She'd been building a case against someone she worked with, someone who had access to her files and strategies, someone who could manipulate evidence and influence witnesses without raising suspicion. The surveillance photographs weren't evidence of her guilt, but documentation of her investigation into someone else's corruption. But if that were true, then the person she'd been investigating knew about her activities, had known and had acted to stop her. I gathered the photographs and returned them to my jacket, suddenly aware of how exposed I'd become. The diner's windows offered no privacy, and my presence here could be observed and reported by anyone with reason to be watching. I left money on the table and walked back into the night, my destination uncertain, but my need for movement overwhelming. The park where she'd fed the ducks lay several blocks away, its paths winding through patches of darkness that seemed to shift and breathe with their own life. I found myself walking toward it, drawn by the memory of her voice describing those lunch breaks, those moments of peace in an increasingly chaotic professional life. The pond reflected the street lights in fractured patterns, its surface disturbed by the gentle movement of waterfowl that should have been roosting, but instead drifted in aimless circles. I sat on the bench she'd mentioned, the one with a view of both the water and the office building, where I'd spent the evening searching through her abandoned workspace. From this angle I could see the corner window of her office, still dark despite my recent presence there. But as I watched, a light appeared briefly, flickering like a candle or the glow of a cell phone screen. It lasted only seconds before disappearing, leaving me to question whether I'd seen anything at all. The photographs in my jacket seemed to pulse with their own warmth, evidence that someone had killed to suppress. But evidence of what exactly? And how could I pursue the truth without becoming the next target of whoever had silenced her? The ducks paddled closer to the shore, their movements creating small wakes in the otherwise still water. They seemed to recognize my presence, to expect the offering of bread or crackers that would never come. Their patient waiting felt like accusation, like a reminder of promises that would remain unfulfilled. I closed my eyes and tried to remember her voice, the cadence of her speech, the particular way she'd pronounced certain words. But memory proved unreliable, shifting and fading even as I tried to grasp it. Had she really sounded frightened during our last conversation? Or was I reconstructing her emotions to fit the narrative I'd constructed from the surveillance photographs? The uncertainty was maddening, the way truth seemed to slip away even as I gathered more evidence. Each answer led to new questions, each revelation cast doubt on previous assumptions. I was chasing shadows, pursuing explanations that might exist only in my own need to understand what couldn't be understood. When I opened my eyes, the office building's corner window showed light again, steady now rather than flickering. Someone was there, moving through the space I'd recently vacated, perhaps discovering that the desk drawers had been opened, but the photographs had been removed. The distance was too great to make out details, but I imagined I could see a figure silhouetted against the glass, looking down toward the park where I sat surrounded by waiting ducks and unanswered questions. The light went out abruptly, leaving the building dark and anonymous once more. But the knowledge remained. Someone else had keys to her office. Someone else had reason to visit it during hours when the building should have been empty. Someone who might now be aware that they weren't the only ones searching for answers. I stood and walked away from the pond, leaving the ducks to their patient vigil. Behind me, the office building loomed against the sky, its windows like closed eyes that might open at any moment to watch my retreat. The photographs in my jacket felt heavier with each step, their weight a reminder that some truths were too dangerous to pursue, too costly to possess. But I kept walking, carrying her secrets into the night, uncertain whether I was seeking justice or simply postponing my own reckoning with whoever had decided she knew too much. The shadows that had pooled so darkly in the corridor now seemed to follow me, spreading outward from the building like ink in water, claiming the streets and sidewalks and all the spaces where truth might hide from those brave enough to seek it. Story 2. It wasn't the first time the clock chimed later than usual. The ticking had always been steady, but sometimes it seemed to gain an extra beat, as if marking time differently for those who listened closely. I dusted the shelves, careful not to disturb the layer settled over the mantelpiece. The air in the room felt denser, though it carried the same scent of old wood and books. I noticed the rug had shifted just a few inches, but enough to make me pause. The corridor outside remained quiet, the light switched cool to the touch. I tidied up quickly, making sure everything appeared untouched. I left the door slightly ajar, though it usually stayed closed. The dust cloth in my hand feels heavier today, or maybe it's my fingers that have grown weak. I fold it twice, then 3 times, watching the fabric compress into something manageable. The morning light catches particles floating through the air, and I wonder if they've always been there or if my stirring has awakened them. She used to say dust was just skin cells and time. Microscopic evidence of living, she called it. Her voice comes back to me in fragments now, never complete sentences, just the cadence of someone who believed in explanations for everything. The phone rang that morning, or was it evening? Memory has a way of rearranging itself when you're not paying attention. She didn't come home last night. The voice belonged to someone official, badge and clipboard official. The kind of person who takes notes while you speak, writing down words you don't remember saying. When did you last see her? I remember looking at the clock then too, the same clock that now seems to run on its own schedule. The hands pointed to numbers that felt wrong, though I couldn't say why. Tuesday or Wednesday, she was writing. That part was true. She was always reading, books stacked beside her chair like a paper fortress, protecting her from conversations she didn't want to have. I can still see her fingers turning pages, the soft whisper of paper against paper. But which book was it? The detail escapes me, slides away like water through cupped hands. The officer wrote something down. His pen made scratching sounds against the paper, filling silence I didn't know how to break. Did she mention any plans, anyone she might be staying with? Plans, the word felt foreign in my mouth when I tried to answer. She didn't make plans the way other people did. She moved through days like smoke, present but not quite solid, there but always partially somewhere else. I walk to the window now, the same window where I stood that day. The view hasn't changed, but something about it feels different. The tree outside has grown, or maybe shrunk. Seasons have a way of distorting perspective. The glass is cold against my palm. I press harder, watching my breath fog the surface. In the condensation, I trace letters without meaning, shapes that disappear as quickly as they form. Her room was exactly as she left it. Bed unmade, clothes draped over the chair like she'd just stepped out for a moment. The book lay open on the nightstand, pages spread like wings. I closed it without reading the title, though I wish now I had looked. The officer asked to see it later. Evidence, he said, though evidence of what remained unclear. She marked passages sometimes, underlined things that meant something to her. I handed him the book, watching my fingerprints join whatever traces she had left behind. The cover was worn smooth, title faded to ghost letters I could barely make out. Days blurred together after that, or maybe they stretched apart, each hour expanding to fill more space than time should allow. People came and went, questions repeated until they lost meaning. The phone rang at intervals that seemed random, but probably followed some pattern I couldn't decode. Any unusual behavior lately, changes in routine, new acquaintances. Unusual, the word stuck in my throat like a fishbone. What was usual for someone who existed in the margins of ordinary life? She collected moments the way others collected stamps, pressing experiences between the pages of memory books I was never allowed to read. I started noticing things after she disappeared, small things, the way shadows fell differently across the kitchen floor, how the refrigerator hummed in a slightly different key. The milk expired on a date that seemed impossible, too soon or too late, I couldn't tell which. Her coffee cup remained on the counter for weeks. I couldn't bring myself to wash it, couldn't bear to put it away. The stain inside had dried to a perfect ring, dark and permanent as a brand. The detective came by regularly at first, different questions, same searching eyes. He had a way of looking at things as if they might confess secrets if he stared long enough. Tell me about her friends. Friends, another word that didn't fit properly. She knew people, spoke to them, shared spaces and conversations, but friendship implied something deeper, connections that ran both ways. Her relationships seemed to flow in one direction only, like water following gravity. There was someone from the library. They talked about books. A name. I realized I had never heard a name, only references. The librarian, the woman with the interesting theories. the person who recommended that author she liked. I don't know. The detective made a note. His handwriting was small and precise, nothing like her sprawling script that filled margins with thoughts too complex for the space provided. I find myself in her room again, though I don't remember walking here. The door stands open wider than I left it, or maybe I'm remembering wrong. Memory has become unreliable, like a clock that keeps different time. Her books remain arranged exactly as she left them, spines aligned with mathematical precision, organized by some system only she understood. I run my finger along their edges, feeling the texture of different papers, different ages. One book sits slightly askew. I don't remember it being out of place before, but then again, I don't trust what I remember anymore. The title catches my eye, Disappearances and Their Meanings. The irony feels too sharp, too convenient. Surely I would have noticed this before. Surely someone would have mentioned it. I open to a random page. Her handwriting fills the margins, notes written in blue ink that has faded to gray. The words swim before my eyes, refusing to hold still long enough for comprehension. The act of vanishing requires both intention and opportunity. One without the other results in mere absence, not true disappearance. Her writing, her thoughts, but when did she write this? And why does it feel like a message meant for later, for now, for this moment when I stand holding evidence of premeditation? The detective's card sits on my kitchen table where I left it months ago. The corners have curled slightly, edges softened by humidity and handling. His number is printed in block letters below his name, which I can never quite remember despite reading it dozens of times. I dial without thinking, muscle memory guiding my fingers across familiar buttons. She knew she was going to disappear. The words leave my mouth before I realize I've spoken them. They hang in the air between us, connected by invisible wires and electronic signals. What makes you say that? His voice sounds different through the phone, smaller somehow, compressed into frequencies that lose the nuances of face-to-face conversation. Her book, she was studying disappearances. Silence stretches between us. I can hear him breathing, thinking, probably writing notes in that precise handwriting. Lots of people read about crime, doesn't mean they're planning anything. But this wasn't crime fiction. These were case studies, academic analyses of people who chose to vanish, people who erased themselves with the same deliberation others used to plan vacations. She underlined sections about preparation, about creating distance before the final step. What kind of distance? I flipped through pages, looking for the passages that seemed so significant moments ago. The text blurs together now, words losing their individual meanings and flowing into streams of black marks on white paper. Emotional distance, practical distance. She wrote notes about severing connections gradually so no one would notice until it was too late. The detective asks me to bring the book to the station. Evidence, he says again, though we both know it's too late for evidence to matter, too late for preparation to be prevented. I hang up the phone and immediately regret making the call. Some knowledge is heavier when shared, more real when spoken aloud. The clock chimes again, that extra beat that makes me pause and count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but which hour, and does it matter anymore? I return to her room, drawn by something I can't name. The book feels different in my hands now, heavier with the weight of revelation. I sit in her chair, the one beside the window where she spent so many hours reading. The cushion still holds the impression of her body, or maybe I imagine it does. Maybe I need to believe some trace of her remains, some physical evidence that she existed here, in this space, in this life we shared without really sharing. Another passage catches my eye, marked with a yellow highlighter that has faded to pale cream. The most successful disappearances are those that feel inevitable in retrospect. The vanished person leaves behind a trail of clues that explain everything while revealing nothing. My hands shake as I turn the page. More notes, more highlighted sections, more evidence of planning that I was too blind to see. Gradual withdrawal from social connections, reduced communication, changes in routine that appear random but follow a careful pattern. Had she withdrawn, I try to remember our last conversation, but it slides away like water, leaving only the impression of words without their substance. We talked about ordinary things, I think, whether groceries, the book she was reading. Always the book she was reading. The phone rings, startling me from thoughts that had grown too heavy to carry. The detective's voice fills the kitchen again, professional and distant. We found her car. The words hit me like physical objects, solid things that demand space in a world suddenly too small to contain them. Where? Parking structure downtown, been there for weeks, maybe longer. Security cameras show her leaving it there, walking away. She didn't look back. Walking away, the image forms in my mind, her figure growing smaller with distance, dissolving into crowds of strangers until she became just another person with somewhere else to be. Was she alone? Appears so. She moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going. After I hang up, I sit in the kitchen holding the silence like something fragile that might break if I move too quickly. The coffee cup still sits on the counter, ring stain now permanent as a tattoo. I wash it finally, watching the water swirl down the drain in patterns that seem meaningful but probably aren't. The cup feels light or clean, emptied of the weight I had assigned to it. The book lies open on the table where I left it. Another highlighted passage draws my attention. The key to successful vanishing is leaving behind just enough mystery to prevent active searching while providing enough closure to allow acceptance. Closure, the word tastes bitter, like medicine that promises healing while delivering only numbness. I close the book and place it with the others, spine aligned according to her mysterious system. The gap where it belonged seems to close automatically, as if the other volumes were waiting for its return. Evening light slants through the windows at angles that transform familiar objects into strangers. Shadows stretch across surfaces, reaching toward darkness that waits patiently at the edges of vision. The detective calls one more time, his voice carrying the weight of conclusions that satisfy no one. Case is being moved to inactive status. No evidence of foul play, no indication she was in danger or distress. Sometimes people just choose to start over somewhere else. Start over, the phrase echoes in my mind long after the conversation ends. Can someone simply choose to become someone else, leave behind one life like discarded clothing and step into another, clean and new and unencumbered by history? I think about the book, the careful notes, the highlighted passages that read like instructions for transformation. Maybe disappearance isn't about vanishing at all. Maybe it's about becoming. The clock chimes its irregular rhythm, marking time that belongs to no standard measurement. I listen to the extra beat, that pause between seconds that creates space for possibilities I hadn't considered. Maybe she didn't disappear. Maybe she simply became someone I never knew, someone who existed in the margins of the life we shared. Maybe the person I thought I knew was the illusion, and her vanishing was just the moment when pretense became too heavy to carry. I dust the shelves again, careful not to disturb the settled patterns. The cloth moves in slow circles, gathering particles of time and skin cells and evidence of living. The air grows dense with stirred memories, fragments of conversations that might have happened or might have been imagined. The rug has shifted again, just a few inches, but enough to make me pause. I straighten it carefully, aligning edges with invisible boundaries that feel important for reasons I can't articulate. The door to her room stands ajar, the way I left it or the way it wants to be. Light from the hallway spills across the threshold, illuminating nothing and everything at once. I leave it open and walk away, carrying questions that have grown comfortable in their lack of answers. Some mysteries are meant to be lived with rather than solved, accepted rather than understood. The clock continues its irregular rhythm, marking time for those who listen closely. I listen now, counting beats that don't match any earthly measure, keeping time with something larger and more patient than human understanding. Outside, the world continues its ordinary business of existing. People come and go, leaving traces and taking memories, creating patterns that mean everything and nothing at all. I fold the dust cloth and put it away, task completed but never finished. Tomorrow I will dust again, and the particles will dance in morning light, and the clock will chime its extra beat, and the mystery will deepen into something that feels almost like peace. She is gone, but gone isn't empty. Gone is full of possibilities I lack the courage to imagine. Gone is a place where transformation happens in languages I don't speak, where becoming requires the kind of faith I've never possessed. The book remains on the shelf, spine aligned with mathematical precision, holding secrets that explain everything while revealing nothing at all. And I remain here, keeper of questions that have learned to answer themselves, guardian of mysteries that protect their own solutions from those too small to hold them. The dust settles, the clock chimes. Time moves forward in its crooked way, carrying us all toward disappearances we haven't chosen yet. Story 3. Each morning, just as dawn began to soften the night, the alarm from the house down the street would buzz exactly twice, pause, and then continue its daily routine. It was almost comforting in its predictability, marking the start of the day as reliably as the sun rising. I never paid it much mind until yesterday. The first buzz came earlier than usual, ending abruptly before the second could sound. Then this morning there was no pause at all, just a continuous, droning note that left a strange stillness in its wake. I can't help but wonder why the silence feels heavier now, like it's waiting for something. The nausea sits in my chest like a stone, cold and immovable. It's been there since I woke, or maybe since I went to sleep. The boundaries blur now. My hands shake as I hold this cup of coffee, watching the surface ripple with each tremor. The liquid has gone cold, but I keep drinking it anyway, tasting nothing but the metallic tang that coats my tongue. Everything tastes like copper now. I remember the sound of footsteps on gravel, how they seemed to echo in my bones before I heard them with my ears. But that was weeks ago, wasn't it? Or was it yesterday? Time folds in on itself when you're not sleeping properly. The footsteps belong to someone obviously, but faces have become unreliable things, shifting like smoke whenever I try to focus on them. The neighbor's curtains were drawn that morning. I noticed because they're never drawn. She's the type who likes to watch the street, likes to see who comes and goes. But that particular morning, or was it evening, the windows stared back at me like closed eyes, blind and unseeing. My reflection in the bathroom mirror startles me, not because of how I look, though I do look terrible, but because for a moment I didn't recognize the person staring back. The eyes were mine, the mouth was mine, but something essential was missing. Like looking at a photograph of someone who resembles you but isn't you. The feeling passes, but it leaves me hollow. There was a conversation, I'm certain of this, though the words themselves have dissolved into impressions. Someone was explaining something to me, their voice urgent but distant, like hearing someone speak underwater. I nodded at appropriate intervals, made the right sounds, but I wasn't really there. I was watching myself from somewhere else, observing this person who looked like me participate in this exchange I couldn't quite grasp. The smell comes back to me in waves, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. It clings to my clothes, my hair, my skin, no matter how many times I shower. Sometimes I catch myself sniffing my own hands, searching for traces of it, and I don't know if I'm hoping to find it or hoping it's finally gone. I found something in my coat pocket yesterday, a small object smooth and warm from being held. I can't remember putting it there, can't remember picking it up, but there it was, fitting perfectly in my palm like it belonged there. When I try to recall where it came from, my mind slides away from the memory like water off glass. The object sits on my kitchen table now, and I find myself staring at it for long stretches of time, waiting for it to reveal its significance. The phone rang 3 times that night. Each time I answered, and each time there was only breathing on the other end. Not heavy breathing, not threatening, just the quiet, steady rhythm of someone alive on the other side of the line. I should have hung up, should have unplugged the phone, but instead I found myself listening, matching my own breathing to theirs until we were synchronized. When the calls stopped, the silence felt more intimate than the breathing had. My hands won't stop moving. They flutter like trapped birds, touching surfaces, straightening objects, smoothing fabric that doesn't need smoothing. I watch them as if they belong to someone else, these restless things attached to my wrists. They seem to know something I don't, searching for something I can't name. The dream comes every night now, though calling it a dream feels inadequate. It's more like remembering something that hasn't happened yet, or forgetting something that's happening now. There's a room I've never seen but know intimately, filled with furniture covered in white sheets. The air tastes of dust and abandonment, but underneath that something else, something organic and patient. I walked past the house this morning, the one with the alarm. The windows were dark and there were newspapers piling up on the front step. How long had they been there? The mailbox hung open like a mouth, stuffed with envelopes that spilled onto the ground. I wanted to knock on the door to check if everything was all right, but my feet wouldn't carry me up the walkway. They knew something my conscious mind refused to acknowledge. The memory surfaces suddenly, unbidden, hands that weren't mine arranging flowers in a vase. The movements were precise, practiced, as if this was a ritual performed many times before. But whose hands, and why can I feel the stems between my fingers, the cool water against my wrists? The sensation is so vivid I have to look down to make sure I'm not actually holding flowers right now. Sleep brings no relief. When I close my eyes, I see patterns in the darkness, geometric shapes that pulse and shift, forming configurations that feel significant but remain meaningless. Sometimes faces emerge from these patterns, but they dissolve the moment I try to focus on them. I wake feeling more tired than when I went to bed, as if I've been working all night on some task I can't remember. The taste of copper grows stronger. I run my tongue over my teeth, checking for blood, but find nothing. The metallic flavor seems to come from deeper inside, from some internal source I can't locate or cleanse. Food has become impossible. Everything I try to eat turns to ash in my mouth, and swallowing has become a conscious effort. There was a key, I'm certain of this detail, though it floats in isolation, unconnected to any door or purpose. It was old brass with an ornate head that felt warm against my palm. I can remember the weight of it, the way it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, but I can't remember what it unlocked or where it came from. Sometimes I dream about doors, rows and rows of them stretching into infinity, and I know that somewhere among them is the one this key was meant for. The neighbor's house remains dark. I've started timing my walks to pass by it multiple times throughout the day, though I tell myself this is coincidental. The newspapers have been removed by whom, but the mailbox still hangs open. Yesterday I thought I saw movement behind one of the upstairs windows, just a flutter of shadow, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. My reflection has begun to lag. When I turn my head, it takes a moment for the mirror version to catch up. When I raise my hand, there's a delay before the reflection responds. I've started avoiding mirrors altogether, but their absence is somehow worse than their presence. At least when I could see myself, I could confirm I was still here. The object on my kitchen table has moved, not far, just a few inches to the left, but I'm certain it's not where I left it. I live alone. The doors are locked, the windows closed, yet there it sits in its new position as if it had simply decided to relocate itself. I want to touch it again, to feel its smooth warmth, but something holds me back, some instinct that whispers warnings I can't quite hear. The conversation I can't remember comes back in fragments. Someone was apologizing, their voice thick with regret, but for what? The harder I try to grasp the details, the more they slip away, leaving only the emotional residue, guilt, sorrow, and something else. Something that feels like relief. I found dirt under my fingernails this morning. Dark, rich earth that smells of rain and decay. I don't remember gardening, don't remember being anywhere that would leave such traces. My shoes are clean, my clothes unmarked, but my hands tell a different story. I scrub at the dirt, but it seems to go deeper than the surface, staining something beneath the skin. The silence where the alarm used to be has taken on a texture, a weight that presses against my eardrums. I catch myself straining to hear that familiar double buzz, that comforting pause, but there's only the absence where the sound should be. Other neighbors must have noticed too, but when I see them on the street, they look through me as if I'm not there. The flowers in my dream, or was it a memory, were white lilies. Their petals were soft as skin, and when I touched them, they left a residue on my fingers that wouldn't wash off. The arrangement was for someone, but I can't remember who. The vase was crystal, heavy and cold, and it caught the light in ways that made rainbows dance across the walls. My hands have stopped shaking, but this feels worse than the tremors. They lie still in my lap, unnaturally calm, as if they've completed whatever task they were so desperate to perform. I flex my fingers, testing their responsiveness, but they move like they're underwater, slow and dreamlike. The phone hasn't rung in days. I've checked the connection, listened for the dial tone, even called myself from my cell phone to make sure it works. It does, but the silence feels different now. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet, as if something is actively choosing not to call. I remember now, or think I do, there was an argument, voices raised in anger, though the words themselves remain elusive. Someone was crying, not sobbing, but the quiet tears that come from deep exhaustion. I can feel the salt tracks on my cheeks, taste the bitterness at the corners of my mouth, but I can't remember if the tears were mine or someone else's. The key appears in dreams now, floating in dark water just out of reach. Each time I try to grasp it, it sinks deeper, leaving ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. When I wake, my hands are clenched into fists and my arms ache as if I've been swimming against a strong current. The neighbor's house has a new occupant. I saw lights in the windows last night, shadows moving behind the curtains. But when I walked by this morning, the newspapers had returned and the mailbox hung open once more, as if the life I witnessed was just another layer of dream, another false memory inserted into the growing catalog of things that might not have happened. The object on my table is gone. I searched everywhere, turned the house upside down, but it simply vanished. In its place is a faint outline in the dust, a perfect circle that marks where it used to sit. I run my finger around the circumference of this ghost print, and for a moment I can almost feel the weight of the object in my other hand. The smell of flowers grows stronger each day. It seeps from the walls, rises from the floorboards, clings to the air like fog. I've opened every window, turned on every fan, but the sweetness remains. Sometimes I think I'm drowning in it, this cloying perfume that reminds me of endings and beginnings all at once. My reflection has stopped appearing altogether. I stand in front of mirrors and see only the room behind me, as if I've become transparent, a ghost haunting my own life. But I can still feel myself, still touch my face and confirm my existence. The disconnect between what I know and what I see creates a vertigo that never quite fades. The memory crystallizes suddenly. I was holding someone's hand. The fingers were cold, unresponsive, but I held on anyway, whispering words of comfort that fell into silence. There was a machine beeping somewhere, a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat, but whose hand was it? And why do I remember letting go feeling like the hardest thing I've ever done? The alarm from down the street sounds again this morning, but it's different now. Instead of the familiar double buzz, it plays a melody soft, haunting, like a lullaby sung by someone who's forgotten most of the words. I listen until it stops, and in the silence that follows, I finally understand what it's been trying to tell me. The house down the street is mine. It always has been. The alarm, the newspapers, the dark windows, they're all mine. I'm looking at my own life from the outside, watching myself disappear one memory at a time. The object in my pocket, the key in my dreams, the flowers I can't stop smelling, they're all pieces of something I'm not ready to remember. But the forgetting is almost complete now, and soon even this realization will fade. I'll be left with only the sensation of loss, the weight of something important slipping away. The silence grows heavier, more patient, and I know it won't have to wait much longer. Story 4. The surveillance equipment registered a blackout at 03:17 a.m. External access points appeared unforced, with all locks engaged and no evident tampering. Internal sensors recorded no movement, save for a subtle deviation by window proximity monitors. Environmental controls maintained preset temperatures consistent with documented schedules. A cup, 3/4 full with an undetermined liquid, rested on the desk without condensation. Inventory listed as intact, although one drawer was ajar by a fraction of its capacity. Security footage for the specified time frame was irretrievable. The sequence was flawless, except for the shadows that didn't align. I read the report for the 5th time that morning, the words blurring together like ink in water. The coffee in my own cup had gone cold, forming a thin film across the surface that reflected the fluorescent lights above. The office hummed with its usual electronic symphony, computers processing data, phones ringing in distant cubicles, the air conditioning cycling through its programmed intervals. But underneath it all, there was something else. A frequency I couldn't quite identify. The building housed a pharmaceutical research facility, one of those sterile environments where every surface gleamed under harsh lighting and every footstep echoed with purpose. I'd been called in to investigate what appeared to be a security breach that wasn't quite a breach. the kind of anomaly that made insurance companies nervous and executives lose sleep. My contact, a woman with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, led me through corridors lined with frosted glass doors. Each room contained workstations arranged in perfect symmetry, computers displaying scrolling data, and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. She spoke in measured tones about protocols and procedures, but I noticed how her fingers drummed against her clipboard, a rhythm that didn't match her calm demeanor. "The affected area is on the third floor," she explained as we entered an elevator that smelled faintly of disinfectant and something organic that seemed out of place in such a sanitized environment. "Laboratory 7, we've sealed it pending your investigation." The elevator climbed with mechanical precision, but I felt a strange sensation in my stomach that had nothing to do with the motion. The numbers above the door changed from 1 to 2 to 3, each accompanied by a soft chime that seemed to linger longer than it should have. Laboratory 7 was larger than I'd expected, filled with workbenches covered in equipment whose purpose I could only guess at. Microscopes, centrifuges, rows of glass containers filled with substances in various stages of analysis. Everything appeared exactly as it should be, which was precisely what made it unsettling. The desk mentioned in the report sat near a window overlooking the parking lot. The cup was still there, its contents having evaporated to leave a residue that formed concentric rings along the ceramic walls. I leaned closer, catching a scent that reminded me of something from my childhood medicine, perhaps, or the antiseptic smell of a hospital waiting room. The drawer was indeed ajar, just as described. Inside, I found the usual collection of office supplies, pens, paper clips, sticky notes arranged in neat stacks. But there was an empty space, a rectangular impression in the dust that suggested something had been removed. The absence was more telling than any evidence left behind. I spent the remainder of the morning interviewing staff members, each conversation adding another layer to the mystery without bringing me closer to resolution. The night security guard insisted he'd made his rounds as scheduled, checking every door and window with the thoroughness of someone who'd performed the same routine for years. Yet when I asked about the specific time frame of the blackout, his certainty wavered. He remembered checking the laboratory, but couldn't recall if the cup had been on the desk or if the drawer had been properly closed. The research assistant who discovered the anomaly that morning spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to documenting every detail. She described arriving at her usual hour, entering the laboratory with her key card, and immediately sensing something was different. Not wrong exactly, but shifted. Like walking into a room where furniture has been moved slightly, creating an environment that looks familiar but feels foreign. "The shadows," she said, echoing the report's final observation. "They fell in directions that didn't match the light sources." I asked her to elaborate, but she struggled to articulate what she'd observed. It was more of a feeling, she explained, an instinct that something fundamental had changed during the hours between her departure the previous evening and her return that morning. As the day progressed, I found myself returning repeatedly to that phrase, shadows that didn't align. I examined the laboratory from every angle, mapping the positions of windows, light fixtures, and objects that might cast shadows. Under normal circumstances, the patterns of light and darkness followed predictable paths, but there were areas where the shadows seemed to bend, creating shapes that defied the geometry of their sources. The building's maintenance records showed no unusual activity. The cleaning crew had followed their standard route, documented by key card entries and security checkpoints. The overnight staff had reported nothing unusual, their logs filled with the mundane details of another routine shift. Yet something had occurred in Laboratory 7, something subtle enough to escape immediate detection but significant enough to leave traces in the building's security systems. I requested access to the backup surveillance footage, hoping to find images from cameras in adjacent areas. The recordings showed empty corridors, emergency lighting casting long shadows across polished floors, and the occasional movement of a security guard making his rounds. But there were gaps, moments where the timestamp jumped forward without explanation, leaving spaces in the record that couldn't be accounted for. The pharmaceutical company's director of security joined me for the afternoon review, a man whose military bearing suggested a background in more serious forms of investigation. He studied the evidence with the same methodical approach I'd been taught to apply to crime scenes, but his conclusions were no more definitive than mine. "Inside job," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Someone with access, someone who knew the systems well enough to minimize their footprint." But that theory raised more questions than it answered. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to enter a laboratory, only to leave everything apparently undisturbed? What could have been removed from that drawer that was valuable enough to justify such a sophisticated operation, yet small enough to escape inventory detection? I found myself thinking about the cup, that mundane object that had somehow become central to the mystery. The liquid inside had evaporated completely, leaving only mineral deposits and a faint stain that resembled a map of some unknown territory. The lack of condensation suggested it had been there for some time before the blackout, but the position perfectly centered on a coaster, aligned with the edge of the desk, implied deliberate placement. The research assistant agreed to stay after hours to walk me through her normal routine. We moved through the laboratory as the evening shift arrived, their presence adding a different energy to the space. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher in the darkening building, casting shadows that shifted as we passed between workstations. She demonstrated her usual procedure, checking equipment, reviewing data from overnight processes, preparing materials for the day's experiments. Her movements were practiced, efficient, but I noticed how she avoided looking directly at the desk where the cup had been found. When I mentioned this, she paused, her hand hovering over a microscope adjustment knob. "It's not what was there," she said finally. "It's what should have been there but wasn't." She couldn't explain what she meant, and I didn't press her. Sometimes the most important observations resist articulation, existing in the space between conscious thought and instinctive recognition. I'd learned to trust those moments of inexplicable certainty, even when they led toward uncomfortable conclusions. As the building emptied for the evening, I remained in Laboratory 7, studying the space under different lighting conditions. The security guard made his rounds, his footsteps echoing in the corridor outside, but the laboratory itself maintained its unsettling silence. I sat at the desk where the cup had been found, trying to understand what someone might have been doing there in the early morning hours. The view from the window showed the parking lot below, illuminated by sodium lights that turned everything the color of old photographs. A few cars remained, belonging to the overnight staff and security personnel, but there were spaces where vehicles had been parked, marked by oil stains and tire impressions that told stories of routine arrivals and departures. I opened the drawer again, running my fingers along the edges of that rectangular absence. The dust pattern was undisturbed except for that one clean space, suggesting whatever had been removed had been there for some time. But the building's inventory system showed no discrepancies, no missing equipment or materials that could account for the empty space. The night security guard appeared in the doorway, his flashlight creating new patterns of light and shadow across the laboratory walls. He seemed surprised to find me still there, though he'd been informed I might be working late. We talked about his routine, the rhythm of checking doors and monitoring systems that had become as natural as breathing. "Sometimes you notice things," he said, adjusting his radio's volume. "Little changes that don't show up in reports, a chair pushed back from a desk, a door that closes differently, nothing you could put in writing but enough to make you wonder." He'd worked security for decades in office buildings and warehouses, hospitals and schools. Each environment had its own personality, he explained, its own way of settling into the quiet hours when most of the world was asleep. But this building had been different lately, though he struggled to identify exactly how. "The sounds," he said finally, "they echo differently now, like the walls are listening." I asked him to elaborate, but he seemed embarrassed by his own observation, shaking his head and muttering about working too many night shifts. Yet I understood what he meant. The building did seem to absorb sound in unexpected ways, creating pockets of silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. After he continued his rounds, I remained alone with the laboratory's collection of shadows and reflections. The equipment hummed with electronic life, processing data and maintaining precise conditions for experiments I couldn't begin to understand. But underneath that technological symphony, there was something else, a frequency that seemed to originate from the building itself. I thought about the pharmaceutical research being conducted here, the development of compounds designed to alter human chemistry in subtle but significant ways. The work required precision and patience, qualities that extended beyond the laboratory into the culture of the organization itself. Everyone I'd interviewed spoke with careful consideration, choosing words that conveyed information without revealing too much about the nature of their research. The cup bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Its placement on the desk suggested someone had been sitting there, drinking something while working or waiting. But the lack of condensation indicated it had been there long enough for the liquid to reach room temperature, which contradicted the timelines suggested by the security systems. I found myself constructing scenarios, each more elaborate than the last. Someone arriving before the blackout, leaving the cup while they worked on something that required removal from the drawer. The power interruption providing cover for their departure, though the building's backup systems should have prevented any complete loss of surveillance capability. But each theory collapsed under scrutiny. The security measures were too comprehensive, the staff too thoroughly vetted, the building too well monitored to allow for such a sophisticated breach. Yet something had undeniably occurred, something that left traces in the dust and shadows while avoiding detection by the building's elaborate security infrastructure. As the night deepened, I began to consider possibilities I'd initially dismissed. The research assistant's certainty about the shadows, the security guard's observations about sound, the director's reluctant acceptance that someone with inside knowledge must have been involved. What if the truth was more complex than a simple break-in or theft? The building around me seemed to pulse with hidden activity, computers processing data through the night, experiments continuing their slow transformations in carefully controlled environments. I realized I'd been thinking about the incident as an isolated event, but what if it was part of something larger, a pattern that extended beyond a single night and a single laboratory? I pulled out my notebook and began mapping connections, drawing lines between observations that might have seemed unrelated. The cup's position, the drawer's contents, the shadows that didn't align with their sources. The security guard's changing perceptions, the research assistant's inexplicable certainty, the director's military precision applied to an imprecise situation. The patterns that emerged were suggestive rather than definitive, pointing toward conclusions I wasn't ready to accept. But as I sat in that laboratory, surrounded by equipment designed to unlock the secrets of human biology, I began to understand that some mysteries resist conventional investigation. Sometimes the evidence points not toward what happened, but toward what might still be happening. The building's night sounds continued around me, a mechanical lullaby that should have been comforting, but instead felt ominous. I thought about the research being conducted here, the careful manipulation of chemical compounds that could alter perception, memory, and behavior in ways that left no obvious traces. When I finally left the building, the security guard walked me to the exit, his footsteps synchronized with mine in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. He wished me luck with the investigation, but his tone suggested he didn't expect me to find answers that would satisfy anyone's curiosity. The parking lot was nearly empty, my car sitting under a sodium light that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. As I drove away, I glanced back at the building in my rearview mirror, noting how certain windows remained illuminated despite the late hour. The research continued, experiments proceeding according to schedules that didn't conform to normal business hours. I never filed a final report on Laboratory 7. The evidence was too ambiguous, the conclusions too speculative for the kind of definitive analysis my clients expected. But I kept thinking about that cup, that drawer, those shadows that refused to align with their sources. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if the real mystery wasn't what happened in that laboratory, but what continues to happen there. The building stands, the research proceeds, and somewhere in the space between observation and understanding, the truth remains suspended like dust in artificial light, visible only when illuminated from precisely the right angle. Story 5. It was always the same every morning, the soft shuffle on the pavement outside my window, like a slow, steady tide of sound fading into the distance. I never paid much attention, just a comforting routine that meant the world outside was still spinning. Until yesterday, the footsteps faltered, a break in the rhythm, a skipped beat, an irregularity. Today they lingered longer, closer, the sound stretching in an unsettling silence. I could swear they paused right outside my door. But maybe it was just the wind, right? The coffee cup was still warm in my hands when I heard it again. That same shuffle, but different now, wrong somehow. I keep telling myself it's nothing, just the morning walker changing their pace, maybe getting tired after all these months of the same route. But there's something else, something I can't quite place. I remember looking out the window once, not recently, but before. The figure was always there, consistent as clockwork, moving past in that methodical way. Gray jacket, I think, or was it blue? The details blur together now, like trying to focus underwater. Why can't I remember their face? The sound stops completely now. No shuffle, no footsteps, just the hollow quiet that makes my skin crawl. I find myself counting the seconds, waiting for it to resume, but it doesn't. The silence stretches until I wonder if I imagine the whole thing. There was a conversation, I'm almost certain of it. Someone asking questions, wanting to know about the morning routine, about what I'd seen. But when, the words feel familiar in my mouth, like I've rehearsed them, but I can't remember speaking them aloud. Every morning, same time, I must have said, never missed a day. But that's not entirely true, is it? There were gaps, spaces where the footsteps should have been but weren't. I just never noticed until now. How long had those gaps been there? The window glass is cold against my palm. I don't remember walking over here, don't remember pressing my hand against it, but here I am. The street outside looks different in this light, emptier, like something's been erased from the picture. I keep thinking about that conversation, the one I can't quite place. Someone official, maybe, taking notes, the scratch of pen on paper, that particular sound that makes you feel like you're being cataloged, filed away. Can you describe them? The voice echoes in my head, but I can't attach a face to it. Just someone walking, nothing unusual. Except there was something unusual. There had to be. Otherwise, why would anyone ask? The newspaper sits folded on the table. I don't remember bringing it in, but it's there. The headlines blur when I try to focus on them, words swimming together like they're trying to hide from me. There's a photograph, grainy and unclear. A street that looks familiar, too familiar. My hands are shaking. When did they start shaking? The footsteps were part of my morning ritual, as essential as the first sip of coffee or the way sunlight crept across the floor. Without them, the whole day feels off balance, like a song missing its rhythm section. I think I called someone once about the footsteps stopping, about the change in routine, but the person on the other end seemed to know already, seemed to be waiting for my call. "We'll send someone over," they said, or did they? The memory feels rehearsed, like dialogue from a play I've forgotten I'm in. There's a knock at the door now, soft, polite, the kind of knock that doesn't want to startle but demands attention anyway. I know I should answer it, know that whoever's there has been expecting me to answer it, but my feet won't move. The gray jacket hangs in my closet. I'd forgotten about it until now. When did I buy a gray jacket? The fabric feels strange under my fingers, like it belongs to someone else, like I borrowed it and forgot to give it back. "We found it by the path," someone says, but there's no one here, just me and the jacket and the persistent knock at the door. The morning walker never carried anything, I'm sure of that. Hands always empty, swinging in that steady rhythm. But there was something, a small object maybe, something that caught the light occasionally. A watch, a ring, the detail hovers at the edge of my memory, refusing to come into focus. The knocking stops, footsteps retreat down the hallway, but they're different from the morning shuffle. Heavier, more purposeful, official. I find myself at the window again, looking down at the street. The pavement is stained where the morning walker used to pass. Dark spots that could be anything. Water damage maybe, oil from a car, but they form a pattern, these stains, a trail that leads somewhere I don't want to follow. The phone rings. I know I should answer it, but I also know what they're going to ask. About the morning routine, about what I saw, about what I might have forgotten to mention. "The same person every day," they'll ask. Yes, I'll say, because it's true. The same shuffle, the same rhythm, the same gray jacket, until it wasn't. But when did it stop being the same? When did the routine break down? The questions multiply in my head, but the answers slip away like smoke. There's something under my fingernails, something dark that wasn't there before. I scrub at it with soap and water, but it won't come clean. Like it's part of me now, embedded too deep to wash away. The newspaper photograph stares up at me from the table. The street in the image could be any street, but I know it's this one. No, it's the path the morning walker took. The headline is clearer now, sharp enough to cut. I remember being asked to identify something. Standing in a room with bright lights and cold air, looking at something I should recognize but don't. The official voices asking if I'm sure, if I want to take another look. "Take your time," they said. "It's important that you're certain." But certain about what? the memory fragments, leaving only the feeling of being watched, evaluated, judged. The morning walker had a routine, but so did I. Same window, same time, same cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. We were connected by that routine, 2 points in a daily constellation. When one point disappears, what happens to the other? I think about calling in sick today. The thought appears fully formed, like it's been waiting for me to discover it. But sick from what? I feel fine. Better than fine, actually. Like a weight has been lifted from my shoulders. The gray jacket in the closet still bothers me. I should remember buying it, remember wearing it, but there's nothing. Just the fabric and the way it fits perfectly, like it was made for me. Someone's walking past my window again. Different footsteps, wrong rhythm. They pause just like the others did, but this pause feels expectant, like they're waiting for something to happen. I don't look outside this time. Don't press my palm against the cold glass or count the seconds of silence. Instead, I sit very still and listen to the sound of my own breathing, my own heartbeat, my own thoughts circling like water down a drain. The stains on the pavement weren't there before. I'm sure of that now. They appeared gradually, day by day, like a slow developing photograph. But photographs of what? There's a business card on my kitchen counter. I don't remember anyone giving it to me, but the edges are worn like I've been carrying it around. A phone number and a name I can't quite make out. The kind of cards you keep meaning to throw away but never do. The morning walker's routine was so precise I could set my clock by it. But clocks can be wrong, can't they? Maybe the routine was never as regular as I thought. Maybe I just wanted it to be, needed it to be, for reasons I can't quite remember. I find myself checking the locks on my door, once, twice, 3 times. The metal is cold and solid under my fingers, real in a way that nothing else feels right now. But even the locks seem different somehow, like they're keeping something in rather than keeping something out. The footsteps outside have stopped again. The silence stretches and expands until it fills every corner of the room. I wonder if this is what the morning walker heard in those final moments. This same oppressive quiet, this same sense of something ending. But nothing ended, did it? Things just changed. Routines shifted. The morning shuffle became something else entirely, something that only I seem to remember. The newspaper is gone from the table. I don't remember moving it, don't remember throwing it away, but it's not there anymore, like it was never there at all. Like the whole morning was just another fragment, another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit. I can hear the footsteps again now, soft and familiar. The same shuffle, the same rhythm, approaching my window just like always. But when I look outside, the street is empty. Just pavement and shadows and those dark stains that could be anything at all. Maybe it was just the wind, right? The question echoes in my head, but I don't remember asking it, don't remember thinking it. It just appeared like everything else, like a memory that belongs to someone else. The gray jacket is still there in the closet, waiting. The footsteps are still there in my head, shuffling. The stains are still there on the pavement, spreading. And I'm still here at the window, watching and waiting for something I can't quite name to begin again. Story 6. The clock hands shifted backward, a tick too soon, syncing with the tremor at the edge of my vision. My coffee mug, warm against my palm, left an imprint on the table, a circle overlapping another circle, gray lines merging. The hallway light flickered twice before settling into a steady hum, yet the familiar rhythm faltered in my chest. A single shoe rested beside the door, its laces untied, the mate conspicuously absent from the rug where it should have lain. My footsteps echoed behind me out of sync, trailing a second too slowly. I turned, and the mirror on the wall reflected an angle I hadn't yet crossed. The missing shoe belonged to someone who never wore laces that loose. I know this with the certainty of watching hands fold laundry, of observing rituals performed daily without thought. Double knots, always double knots, pulled tight until the leather creased. The precision of someone who measured coffee grounds and aligned books by height on shelves. I found myself writing notes on torn paper, small observations that meant nothing individually but accumulated like sediment. The way the shower curtain hung slightly askew, how the refrigerator hummed in a different key, the smell of unfamiliar soap lingering in the bathroom, sweet where it should have been sharp. My neighbor spoke to me across the fence, words that felt rehearsed. Her eyes kept drifting to my kitchen window, counting something I couldn't see. She mentioned how quiet things had been lately, how peaceful. The emphasis on peaceful made my skin tighten. When I asked what she meant, she smiled and changed the subject to her roses, their thorns growing longer this season. The basement door stands ajar. I don't remember opening it, but memory has become unreliable lately. Sometimes I find myself in rooms without recalling the journey there. The wooden steps creak in a pattern I've memorized: third step, seventh step, then silence until the concrete floor. But today there's an extra creak, one that doesn't match my weight distribution. I keep returning to that morning, the one that feels both recent and impossibly distant. Coffee brewing in the automatic maker, programmed the night before. 2 cups prepared, though I live alone now. Habit, I told myself, muscle memory from years of shared mornings. But the second cup had been used, a faint lipstick trace around the rim in a shade I've never worn. The photographs on the mantle seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. Not dramatically, just enough to make me question my perception. A slight tilt, a different spacing between frames. In one picture, I'm standing beside someone whose face has been carefully scratched out with a pen. The scratches are methodical, deliberate, forming a pattern I almost recognize. Detective work becomes personal when you're investigating your own life. I started cataloging inconsistencies like evidence. The grocery receipt for items I don't remember buying, the appointment card in my purse for a doctor I've never seen, the key on my ring that fits no lock in my house. Each discovery felt like uncovering someone else's secrets hidden in my own belongings. The phone rings at irregular intervals, always when I'm in another room. By the time I reach it, silence greets me, not the harsh buzz of a disconnected line, but the soft breathing of someone listening. I've started timing my approach, moving faster, but the caller seems to anticipate my urgency. Sometimes I pick up before the first ring completes, but the line is already dead. My handwriting appears in places I don't remember writing. Shopping lists with items crossed out in ink darker than I typically use. Appointments written in margins of books. Phone numbers on sticky notes attached to mirrors. The handwriting is mine. I recognize the particular slant of my letters, the way I dot my I's, but the thoughts behind the words feel foreign. The missing shoe's mate turned up in the garden, buried shallow beneath the tomato plants. Dirt clung to the leather and something had chewed through the heel. I held it, trying to remember the last time I'd worn this pair, but the memory slipped away like water through fingers. The shoes were expensive, bought for a special occasion that now exists only as a receipt in my jewelry box. Sleep brings dreams that feel more like memories. I'm standing in my kitchen, but it's arranged differently. The refrigerator on the opposite wall, the table positioned to catch light that streams from a window that doesn't exist. Someone is cooking, their back to me, humming a tune I almost recognize. When they turn, their face is my face, but the expression is one I've never worn. The basement revealed its secret gradually. First, the smell, not decay, but something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. Then the scratches in the concrete, patterns that suggested furniture had been dragged across the floor. Finally, the stain near the water heater, brown and irregular, scrubbed but not completely erased. I knelt beside it, pressing my palm to the cold floor, and felt recognition flutter in my chest like a trapped bird. My reflection has started moving independently. Not dramatically, just a fraction of a second's delay, as if the mirror version of me is making decisions before I am. I brush my teeth, and my reflection begins the motion just before my hand moves. I turn to leave, and my reflection has already started turning. It's subtle enough that I question whether I'm imagining it, but persistent enough that I've stopped looking directly into mirrors. The journal I don't remember keeping documents a relationship I don't remember having. Pages of careful observations about someone's habits, their preferences, their schedule. The handwriting is mine, but the perspective feels like surveillance. I read about arguments I don't recall, reconciliations that exist only on paper, promises made to someone whose name is never mentioned, only referred to as you. Evidence accumulates in my peripheral vision. The extra plate in the dishwasher, washed but bearing traces of food I didn't prepare. The impression on the couch cushion beside where I always sit, as if someone has been sharing my evenings. The bathroom scale showing a weight that fluctuates beyond my own variations. These details whisper of a presence I can't quite grasp. The truth arrived wearing my own clothes, carrying my own keys, speaking in my own voice. I found the photographs hidden in the basement, developed in a makeshift darkroom behind the water heater. Pictures of me sleeping, eating, reading, unaware of being observed. In some images, I'm talking to someone outside the frame, someone the camera deliberately excludes. My expression in these photos is unfamiliar, softer, more animated, as if I'm performing a version of myself I don't recognize. My neighbor stopped speaking to me after I asked about the person she'd seen leaving my house in the early morning hours. Her face went pale, and she stepped backward into her garden, crushing her prize roses beneath her feet. She mumbled something about not wanting to get involved, about minding her own business. But her eyes held knowledge she refused to share, and I understood that my questions had confirmed something she'd been hoping wasn't true. The final piece lay in my own handwriting, in a letter addressed to no one, hidden in the pages of a book I'd been reading. The confession detailed everything with clinical precision, the careful planning, the methodical execution, the disposal of evidence. But as I read, I realized the letter described events from two perspectives, the perpetrator and the victim. Both voices were mine, both handwritings identical, both stories true. Standing in my kitchen now, I watch the coffee maker brew 2 cups again, and I no longer fight the routine. The missing shoe has been replaced by another pair, laces tied in perfect double knots. The basement door remains closed, but sometimes I hear footsteps on the stairs, my own gate echoing from below. The mirror reflects what I expect to see, but sometimes I catch a glimpse of someone else wearing my face, someone who knows exactly what happened in this house. The clock hands continue their backward tick, and I realize I've been counting time in reverse, measuring not what's coming, but what's already passed. My coffee mug leaves its circular imprint on the table, overlapping the rings that came before, creating a pattern that speaks of repetition, of cycles, of returns. And in the hallway, the light flickers twice before settling into its steady hum, marking time for a dance that never quite ends. Story 7. The garage door was partially raised upon inspection. The vehicle inside was undisturbed, showing no signs of recent use, with dust settled uniformly on its hood. The tool rack was complete, all implements in designated slots except for the wrench resting beneath the workbench. Cobwebs stretched across the corners, untouched by movement. The air carried a faint scent, reminiscent of sweet decay, though no source was immediately visible. A faint electronic hum emanated from the fuse box, operational yet never accessed. No prints were detectable on the switch panels, save for a single, incomplete smudge on the rearview mirror. I run my finger along the edge of my coffee cup now, feeling the ceramic ridge where a chip has formed. The sensation brings me back to that morning, though I can't say which morning exactly. Time has a way of folding in on itself when you've spent months turning over the same details, examining them like stones worn smooth by repetition. The smell, that's what stays with me most clearly, though I've never been able to place it. Sweet, yes, but with an undertone of something metallic, like fruit left too long in the sun, mixed with the taste of pennies on your tongue. I remember crouching beside that workbench, my knees protesting against the concrete floor. The wrench shouldn't have been there, everything else in its place, arranged with the kind of precision that speaks to habit, to routine, to someone who found comfort in order. But the wrench, lying there like an afterthought, like something dropped in haste or placed with deliberate carelessness. The detective asked me about it, I think, or maybe I asked him. The conversations blur together now, fragments of questions and non-answers that circle back on themselves. Did you notice anything unusual about the positioning of the tools? Everything was where it should be. Except the wrench. Except the wrench. But was that what he said or what I said? Memory has a way of editing itself, filling in gaps with what seems reasonable, what fits the narrative we're trying to construct. I close my eyes and try to reconstruct that space. The garage was smaller than it appeared from outside, cramped with the accumulated detritus of suburban life. Christmas decorations in labeled boxes stacked against one wall. A lawnmower that looked like it hadn't been used in seasons. Garden hoses coiled with the kind of precision that matched the tool arrangement. The car itself was unremarkable. Mid-sized sedan, maybe 10 years old, the kind of vehicle that disappears into traffic. I remember pressing my palm against the hood, feeling for residual warmth, though the dust told its own story. How long does it take for dust to settle so uniformly? Days, weeks. I asked someone about this, a mechanic maybe, or another detective. The answer was vague, dependent on too many variables to be useful. Humidity, air circulation, the season, everything and nothing. The rearview mirror haunts me in a way I can't articulate. That single smudge, incomplete, as if someone had reached up to adjust it and then stopped mid-motion, or tried to wipe it clean and gave up. The print was too partial for identification, just a swirl of ridges that could have belonged to anyone. But it was fresh, fresher than anything else in that space. I've driven past the house since then, though I probably shouldn't have. It looks different now, or maybe I remember it differently than it actually was. The garage door is fully closed, and I wonder if new people live there, if they've discovered anything we missed, if they smell that same sweet decay on certain mornings when the air is still. There was a neighbor who claimed to have heard something, not on the night in question, but sometime before, a grinding sound like metal on metal. She couldn't be more specific about when, only that it had struck her as unusual at the time. He was always so quiet, she said, kept to himself, you know, but took care of his things. This is what people always say, isn't it? The quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who maintain their tools and organize their Christmas decorations by year and type. As if orderliness were somehow suspicious, as if the absence of obvious dysfunction were itself a red flag. I think about that wrench more than I should. Chrome handle, slight wear on the grip from years of use. It wasn't thrown down or dropped carelessly. It was placed deliberately but not quite right. like someone unfamiliar with the system trying to return it to its proper spot and getting close but not exact. Or like someone who knew exactly where it belonged, but whose hands were shaking too much to place it correctly. The fuse box hummed with that particular frequency of electrical current under load. I stood close enough to feel the vibration in my chest, wondering what was drawing power in a house that had been empty for days. Refrigerator, probably. Water heater. The invisible infrastructure of a life interrupted but not yet dismantled. I opened the box, though I'm not sure I was supposed to. All the breakers were in their proper positions, labeled in neat handwriting that matched the precision of everything else in that space. Kitchen, living room, master bedroom, garage, each one exactly where it should be, doing exactly what it was meant to do. But someone had touched the box recently. The metal door showed fingerprints, not clear enough to lift but visible in the right light. Why would someone need to access the electrical panel? What would draw them there in those final days? The questions multiply faster than the answers. They always do. I remember sitting in my car afterward, trying to process what I'd seen and what I'd missed. The sweet smell clung to my clothes, or maybe I imagined it did. I rolled down the windows and drove with the air conditioning off, trying to clear my head, but the scent seemed to follow me home. My partner said I was overthinking it. Cases like this, he said, the obvious answer is usually the right one. People disappear because they want to disappear or because someone wants them to disappear. The details we obsess over, the out-of-place wrenches and incomplete fingerprints, they're usually just noise. But noise has its own patterns, doesn't it? Its own logic. I've read the file so many times the pages are soft with handling. Witness statements that contradict each other in small but significant ways. Timeline gaps that could mean everything or nothing. A cell phone that stopped transmitting data at 11:47 p.m., though no one could say whether it was turned off, destroyed, or simply moved beyond tower range. The last text message was to a sibling, something mundane about weekend plans. The last call was to a pizza place that had been closed for renovations for 2 weeks. When I followed up on this detail, the manager looked at me like I was speaking another language. Closed for renovations, he repeated, had a sign up and everything. But the call had lasted 47 seconds. You don't stay on the line for 47 seconds with a disconnected number. You don't have a conversation with silence. Unless the call wasn't to the pizza place at all. Phone records can be wrong, systems glitch, data gets corrupted, towers misroute signals. I've seen it before, cases where the digital breadcrumbs led nowhere because the bread was stale to begin with. Or someone knew how to make it look like a glitch. I find myself returning to that garage in my mind, walking through it step by step, trying to notice what I missed the first time. The cobwebs were undisturbed, but cobwebs are fragile things. How much movement would it take to break them? A strong breeze, a careful person moving slowly through the space. The dust on the car hood was uniform, but what does uniform really mean? I should have taken samples, had them analyzed. Dust composition can tell you things about timeline, about air circulation patterns, about what kinds of particles were in the air when it settled. But I didn't think of it at the time. You never think of everything at the time. The detective in charge of the case was transferred before it was closed. Routine reassignment, nothing suspicious about it, but it meant starting over with someone new, someone who hadn't stood in that garage and breathed that sweet, metallic air. The new detective read the file, looked at the photos, and reached conclusions based on data rather than instinct. Missing person cases go cold fast when there's no body, no clear evidence of foul play. People have the right to disappear, and sometimes they exercise it in ways that look suspicious to those left behind. But the wrench, I keep coming back to the wrench. I drove to a hardware store afterward, trying to find one exactly like it. Same brand, same size, same wear pattern on the grip. I wanted to hold it, to feel its weight, to understand what it might have been used for in those final hours. The clerk was helpful in the way retail workers are trained to be, but he couldn't tell me anything useful about the tool itself. Standard model, sold by the thousands, no distinguishing characteristics. The kind of wrench you'd find in any well-equipped garage. Popular with the weekend mechanics, he said. Good quality, but not professional grade. Weekend mechanics, someone who maintained their own vehicle, fixed minor problems, changed their own oil. Someone careful with their tools, organized, methodical. Someone who would never leave a wrench under the workbench unless something had gone very wrong. I think about the smudge on the rearview mirror more than I should. Partial prints are frustrating because they suggest so much while proving so little. Was someone adjusting the mirror to see something behind them, checking their appearance before leaving, trying to wipe away evidence of their presence? Or was it older than we thought, unrelated to the disappearance entirely? The forensics team processed the scene with their usual thoroughness, but thoroughness has its limits. You can't test every surface, catalog every fiber, analyze every particle of dust. You make decisions about what's relevant and what's background noise, and sometimes you get it wrong. I wonder what we missed because we didn't know it was important at the time. The house itself yielded few clues. Everything in its place, no signs of struggle, no indication of hasty departure. Clothes still in the closet, toiletries in the bathroom, mail sorted and filed with the same precision that characterized the garage. But there were gaps, subtle ones, the kind you'd only notice if you knew what to look for. A space in the medicine cabinet where something had been removed, an empty hook in the hall closet, a gap in the bookshelf where a volume had been pulled but not replaced. What do you take when you're planning to disappear? What do you leave behind when someone else is making the decisions for you? I interviewed the neighbors multiple times, hoping someone would remember a detail they'd forgotten in the initial canvas. The woman who heard the grinding sound was the most helpful, though her timeline remained frustratingly vague. It was unusual, she insisted. He wasn't the type to work on projects late at night. But when was late at night? What kind of sound exactly? Metal on metal could describe a dozen different activities, from car repair to home improvement to something more sinister. Like dragging, she said during our third conversation, like something heavy being moved across concrete. This was a new detail, one that hadn't appeared in her original statement. Memory is unreliable that way, adding layers of interpretation with each retelling. But it was also possible she was remembering more clearly, that the shock of the initial interview had clouded her recollection. Or that she was telling me what she thought I wanted to hear. The missing person had no obvious enemies, no financial troubles, no history of mental health issues that might suggest voluntary disappearance. Steady job, regular habits, social connections that were limited but stable. The kind of person who pays their bills on time and returns library books before they're due. The kind of person who doesn't just vanish without explanation. But people are more complicated than their public personas suggest. Everyone has secrets, hidden stresses, private struggles that don't show up in background checks or neighbor interviews. Maybe the orderliness was a facade, a way of maintaining control over a life that was spinning out in ways no one could see. Or maybe it was exactly what it appeared to be, and something external had disrupted a carefully maintained existence. I found myself driving past the hardware store where I'd looked for the wrench, though I couldn't articulate why. The parking lot was mostly empty, and I sat in my car wondering what I hoped to discover. The clerk probably wouldn't remember me, and even if he did, what new information could he provide? But I went in anyway, drawn by the same compulsion that had me reviewing the case file long after it had been officially shelved. "You're back," the clerk said, surprising me, "still working on that project." I hadn't mentioned that I was investigating a case, had let him assume I was a homeowner with a repair job. Now I wasn't sure how to respond without revealing more than I intended. "Still trying to understand how the tool works," I said, which was true in a way. He led me to the same display, picked up the same model wrench, demonstrated its basic function with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this countless times. "Adjustable," he said. "See how the jaw opens and closes. You can work with different sized bolts, nuts, fittings, versatile tool." Versatile, the word stuck with me as I drove home. A tool that could be used for its intended purpose or adapted for other needs, mechanical work or something else entirely. The case file mentioned that the missing person had been taking evening classes at the community college. Auto mechanics, basic level, learning to maintain their own vehicle, becoming more self-sufficient. The instructor remembered them as a dedicated student, always early, always prepared, the kind of person who took detailed notes and asked thoughtful questions. Seemed like they really wanted to understand how things worked, the instructor said. Not just memorize procedures, but really get the principles. This suggested someone methodical, someone who would organize their tools carefully and return them to their proper places after use. Someone who would never leave a wrench under the workbench unless circumstances prevented them from following their usual routine. But what circumstances? I think about the electronic hum from the fuse box, that steady vibration that spoke of systems functioning normally even as the human life they supported had been disrupted. Power flowing to appliances that no one was using, lights that no one was turning on, a garage door opener that no one was operating. Except someone had operated it, recently enough to leave that partial print on the mirror, to disturb the dust patterns just enough to suggest movement without obvious signs of disturbance. The garage door itself was electric, controlled by a remote that should have been clipped to the car's visor, but it wasn't there when we processed the scene. Another small detail that could mean everything or nothing. Had someone taken the remote, used it to access the garage from outside, or was it simply misplaced, fallen between seats or left in a pocket? I requested the records from the power company, looking for any unusual spikes or patterns in electrical usage during the relevant time period. The data showed normal consumption, the predictable rhythms of a single-person household. Refrigerator cycling on and off, water heater maintaining temperature, the baseline draw of electronics in standby mode. But there was a brief spike around 2 a.m. on the night in question. Nothing dramatic, just a temporary increase in draw that lasted about 20 minutes before returning to normal. What runs for 20 minutes in the middle of the night? Washer or dryer maybe, though both appliances were empty when we checked. garage door opening and closing repeatedly, some kind of power tool. Or the overhead light in the garage illuminating work that couldn't wait for daylight. I went back to the neighbor who'd heard the grinding sound, armed with this new timeline. Could she be more specific about when she'd heard the noise? Was it possible it had been around 2 a.m. rather than earlier in the evening as she'd originally stated? I don't know, she said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. It could have been. I just remember it woke me up and I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Sleep distorts time, makes it difficult to place events in proper sequence. What seems like early evening might actually be the middle of the night. What feels like a brief sound might have lasted much longer. But 20 minutes is a long time to be working in a garage at 2 a.m., especially for someone whose neighbors described them as quiet and considerate. The missing person's employer confirmed that they'd been scheduled to work the following day, had never missed a shift without calling in advance. Their desk was organized, projects up to date, no indication that they'd been planning an extended absence. Reliable, the supervisor said, maybe not the most social person in the office, but you could count on them to get things done. Another piece of the pattern, someone who planned ahead, followed routines, honored commitments. Someone whose sudden absence would be noticed precisely because it was so out of character. I found myself wondering about the sweet smell in the garage, that cloying scent that had seemed to follow me home. Had anyone else noticed it? The first responders, the forensics team, the detective in charge of the initial investigation. I checked the scene reports, looking for any mention of unusual odors. Nothing. Either I was the only one who detected it, or it hadn't seemed significant enough to document. But smells are evidence too, aren't they? They tell stories about chemical processes, biological changes, the presence of substances that might not be visible to the naked eye. I should have mentioned it at the time, should have insisted on air quality testing, chemical analysis, something more than just my subjective impression of sweetness mixed with metal. But I didn't, and now it's too late. The case has been officially closed, filed under voluntary disappearance with no evidence of foul play. The missing person is presumed to have left of their own accord, possibly to start a new life elsewhere. It happens more often than people think, the detective told me. Adults have the right to disappear if they choose. But rights and reality don't always align, do they? I still drive past the house sometimes, though I know I shouldn't. The garage door remains closed, and I wonder if the new residents have found anything we missed. A note tucked behind the workbench, a hidden compartment in the tool chest, some explanation for the wrench that was out of place and the fingerprint that led nowhere. Or maybe there's nothing to find. Maybe the story is exactly what it appears to be. Someone who decided they needed a fresh start and took steps to ensure they couldn't be followed. But I keep thinking about that 20-minute power spike, about the grinding sound the neighbor heard, about the sweet smell that clung to my clothes long after I left the scene. Evidence doesn't lie, but it doesn't always tell the truth either. It just exists, waiting for someone to arrange it into a pattern that makes sense, to construct a narrative that explains the unexplainable. And sometimes the pattern you see depends on where you're standing when you look. The wrench is still there in my mind, lying beneath that workbench like a question mark made of chrome and steel. Out of place in a space where everything else belonged, significant in its insignificance, important because it didn't fit. I hold onto that detail the way you hold onto a photograph of someone you've lost, knowing it can't bring them back but unable to let it go. Because sometimes the things that don't make sense are the only things that matter. And sometimes a wrench is just a wrench, dropped by accident and forgotten in the rush of more pressing concerns. But I don't think so. Not anymore, Story 8. The clock chimed once, but the minute hand barely twitched. My reflection in the mirror stretched oddly, as if caught mid-motion before settling back into place. The floorboards felt unfamiliar underfoot, the creak repeating a beat off my usual rhythm. Each morning the kettle sings its whistle, yet today it hummed a solemn, unfamiliar tune. I glanced at the door, noticing the keyhole glimmer twice in rapid succession. It shouldn't have flickered, but it did. The nausea comes in waves now, rolling through my stomach like something alive. I press my palm against the cool surface of the bathroom sink, watching water drip from the faucet in irregular intervals. 1 drop, 3 drops, nothing. Then a steady stream that shouldn't be there because I never turn the handle. My hands shake as I reach for the towel, and suddenly I'm remembering her hands. Small hands with bitten nails, fingers that drummed against surfaces when she was nervous. The sound echoes in my head, tap, tap, tap like Morse code, spelling out accusations I can't decode. She was sitting in the passenger seat, wasn't she? Or was I the one riding along, watching the speedometer climb higher than it should have? The memory shifts like smoke, reforming into something else entirely. Maybe we were standing in the kitchen and she was holding that ceramic mug with the chip on the handle, the one that cut her lip once, leaving a thin line of red that she dabbed away with her sleeve. The guilt tastes metallic, coating my tongue with the flavor of old pennies. I swallow hard, but it doesn't go away. It never goes away. I remember the sound first, not the impact, but what came before. A sharp intake of breath, mine or hers, I can't tell anymore. The distinction seems important, but every time I try to focus on it, the memory fractures like glass hitting concrete. There was a bird that morning, a crow maybe, or something darker. It sat on the fence post, watching us with one black eye while the other seemed to look somewhere else entirely. Birds don't usually bother me, but this one made my skin crawl. Its beak opened and closed without making sound, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. The coffee was cold when I finally drank it. I remember that detail with startling clarity, the bitter dregs at the bottom of the cup, the way the liquid felt thick against my teeth. She had made it too strong, the way she always did, as if she was trying to wake up something in me that had been sleeping too long. My reflection in the spoon was upside down, distorted. When I looked up, she was watching me from across the table, her expression unreadable. Had we been fighting, the air felt charged, electric, with unspoken words, or maybe that was later, after everything changed. The phone rang 7 times before the machine picked up. I counted each ring, my fingers tapping the rhythm against my thigh. The voice that answered wasn't mine, but it spoke with my words, made promises I didn't remember making. When the beep came, silence stretched between us like a held breath. I close my eyes and see the dashboard lights again, red numbers glowing in the darkness, counting something I didn't want to measure. The radio was playing that song, the one with the haunting melody that gets stuck in your head for days. She reached over to change the station, and her hand brushed mine on the gear shift. Her skin was cold, too cold for someone who'd been sitting in a warm car. When I looked at her, really looked, her lips had a blue tinge that made my chest tighten with something beyond fear. But that couldn't be right, because we hadn't been driving anywhere. We were in the house, in the kitchen, and she was laughing at something I'd said. Wasn't she? The laughter echoes now, bouncing off the walls of my memory like a ball thrown too hard. It doesn't sound like joy anymore. It sounds like something breaking, like glass singing just before it shatters. I find myself checking the locks again, running my fingers over the deadbolt until the metal warms under my touch. The keyhole stares back at me, dark and empty, but I swear I can feel something watching from the other side. My neighbor's dog hasn't stopped barking in 3 days, a constant background noise that sets my teeth on edge. The newspaper was still folded on the table when I came back inside. I hadn't read it, couldn't bring myself to look at the headlines that might contain words I wasn't ready to see. The crossword puzzle was half finished, filled out in her careful handwriting. 7 across, one who vanishes without warning. The answer was written in pencil, but when I looked closer, the squares were empty. My hands move without conscious direction, opening drawers and closing them, searching for something I can't name. Her hairbrush sits on the bathroom counter, strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. I should throw it away, but every time I reach for it, my fingers stop just short of contact. The smell hits me suddenly, her perfume mixed with something else, something clinical and sharp. It's strongest near the closet, where her clothes hang in perfect rows like soldiers awaiting orders. The empty hangers rattle when I walk past, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. I remember the hospital corridor now, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. The floor was that particular shade of green that exists nowhere in nature, polished to a shine that reflected everything twice. My footsteps echoed, each one a small explosion in the sterile silence. But we never went to the hospital, did we? That was someone else's story, someone else's nightmare. We were at the lake, skipping stones across the dark water. She was better at it than me, could make a flat rock dance across the surface 7, 8, 9 times before it finally surrendered to the depths. The water was colder than it looked. When I dipped my hand beneath the surface, the shock of it traveled up my arm like electricity. She laughed and splashed me, droplets catching the light like scattered diamonds. Her hair was wet, plastered to her skull in dark ribbons. Why was her hair wet? We hadn't gone swimming. The season was wrong for swimming, too cold, too dangerous. The warning signs were posted all along the shore, red letters on white backgrounds that seemed to pulse with urgency. My therapist's voice drifts back to me, soft and measured. Trauma can fragment memory, rearrange events in ways that feel more bearable. But nothing about this feels bearable. The fragments cut like broken glass, each piece reflecting a different version of the truth. I'm standing in the garage now, though I don't remember walking here. The concrete floor is stained with something dark that could be oil or could be something else entirely. The stain has a shape to it, almost human in its outline. When I blink, it's just a random pattern again, meaningless as spilled paint. Her bicycle leans against the far wall, tires flat, chain rusted. She used to ride it to the market every morning, coming back with paper bags full of vegetables and stories about the people she'd met along the way. The basket still holds a receipt, faded now but readable if I squint. Milk, bread, apples, the ordinary purchases of an ordinary life. The receipt is dated after she left. That's impossible, of course. Paper doesn't lie, but memory does. Memory takes liberties, rearranges facts to suit its own twisted narrative. I crumple the receipt and let it fall, but when I look down, it's smooth again, pristine as fresh snow. Sleep brings no relief. In my dreams, she's always just around the corner, just out of sight. I follow the sound of her footsteps down endless hallways that smell like disinfectant and fear. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of her shadow on the wall, but when I turn to look directly, there's nothing there but empty space. The detective had kind eyes, I remember that. He sat across from me in a room with no windows, his hands folded on a table that had seen too many conversations like ours. His questions were gentle but persistent, like water wearing away stone. I answered honestly, or thought I did, but the words that came out of my mouth felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. "Tell me about that evening," he said, and I opened my mouth to speak but found only silence. What evening? There had been so many evenings, strung together like pearls on a broken necklace. How could I choose just one? The evening when she made dinner and we ate by candlelight, talking about plans that would never come to pass. The evening when we fought about money, our voices rising until the neighbors pounded on the wall. The evening when she didn't come home at all, and I sat by the window until dawn, watching for headlights that never appeared. Or was it the evening that exists only in the spaces between my thoughts, the one I can't quite grasp but can't quite forget? The one where something shifted, where the ordinary world tilted just enough to let the darkness seep in. I find myself counting things obsessively now. Steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, 17. Tiles on the bathroom floor, 64. Seconds between heartbeats when the panic rises, too many to track. Numbers feel solid, reliable in ways that memories don't. The photograph on the mantel shows us together, smiling at the camera with the practiced ease of people who have posed for countless pictures. But when I look closely, something's wrong with the image. Our shadows fall in different directions, as if we were photographed separately and combined later. Her smile doesn't reach her eyes, and my hand on her shoulder looks more like a claw than a gesture of affection. I don't remember taking that picture. I don't remember most of our pictures, actually. They exist like artifacts from someone else's life, evidence of a happiness I can't quite recall feeling. The mailbox holds bills and advertisements, the mundane debris of a life that continues despite everything. But buried among the junk mail is an envelope with her handwriting, my name spelled out in her careful script. The postmark is smudged, unreadable. Inside, a single sentence, "You know what you did." But I don't, that's the problem, isn't it? The knowing sits just beyond my reach, like something glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanishes when you turn to look directly. The harder I try to remember, the more the truth seems to slip away. The clock chimes again, though no time has passed, or maybe hours have passed, maybe days. Time moves strangely now, folding in on itself like origami made of minutes and seconds. I stand before the mirror again, watching my reflection stretch and contract like something viewed through water. My face looks different, older maybe, or just tired in a way that sleep won't fix. There are lines around my eyes that weren't there before, creases that map the geography of guilt and confusion. When I smile, the expression feels foreign, like wearing someone else's skin. The kettle whistles, but I haven't put it on the stove. I find it sitting on the counter, steam rising from its spout in lazy spirals. The water inside is the perfect temperature for tea, as if someone has been caring for it in my absence, as if someone else is living in this house, moving through these rooms like a ghost made of routine and habit. I pour the water over a tea bag, watching the color bleed out in brown tendrils. The smell is familiar but wrong, like a song played in the wrong key. She always preferred coffee, said tea was too delicate, too easily ruined. But here I am, drinking tea and thinking of her, and the contradiction feels important in a way I can't articulate. The phone rings and I let it. The machine picks up and my voice, or something that sounds like my voice, delivers a message I don't remember recording. The caller doesn't leave a message, just breathes into the silence before hanging up. The breathing sounds familiar, like an echo of something I should recognize. Night falls without warning, or maybe I've simply stopped noticing the passage of time. The windows show darkness where there should be street lights, empty space where there should be the familiar landmarks of my neighborhood. It's as if the world beyond these walls has simply ceased to exist, leaving me alone with my fractured thoughts and the persistent feeling that I'm forgetting something crucial. The basement door stands slightly ajar, though I'm certain I closed it this morning. Or was it yesterday? The distinction seems less important now, like a question asked in a language I used to speak fluently but have somehow forgotten. Cool air rises from the darkness below, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and unsettling. I should go down there. I know I should know that whatever I'm trying so hard not to remember is waiting for me in that subterranean darkness. But my feet remain planted on the kitchen floor, my hand frozen inches from the doorknob. Some instinct deeper than thought keeps me rooted here, safe in the realm of partial knowledge and comfortable denial. The house settles around me with small creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure adjusting to invisible pressures. Or maybe it's not the house at all. Maybe it's something else, something that has learned to mimic the familiar sounds of home. The thought should terrify me, but instead it brings a strange kind of relief. If the house itself is complicit in this deception, then maybe I'm not as alone as I thought. Her coffee cup still sits in the sink, a ring of dried liquid marking where the coffee once was. I should wash it, should clear away this evidence of a presence that may or may not have been real. But every time I reach for it, my hand stops, as if the cup exists behind invisible glass that I can see through but not touch. The mirror in the hallway reflects the wrong room. Instead of the familiar walls and furniture, it shows a space I don't recognize, filled with shadows that move independently of any light source. When I step closer, the reflection corrects itself, snapping back to reality with an almost audible click. But the wrongness lingers, a taste in the air like copper pennies and fear. I'm running out of ways to avoid the truth, running out of corners to hide in and distractions to lose myself in. The knowledge sits in my chest like a weight growing heavier with each breath, each heartbeat, each moment of continued denial. Soon, very soon, I'll have to open that basement door and face whatever waits below. But not yet, not quite yet. For now, I can still pretend that the woman in my memories is simply away, simply delayed by traffic or weather or any of the thousand small emergencies that can keep a person from coming home. I can still pretend that the smell rising from the basement is just dampness, just the ordinary decay that comes with old houses and older secrets. The clock chimes again, and this time the minute hand moves, just a little, just enough to mark the passage of time I can no longer deny. The keyhole glimmers once more, and I realize with crystalline certainty that whatever is watching from the other side isn't waiting to get in. It's waiting for me to finally, inevitably, go down, Story 9. My fingertips brushed the cold metal, but felt no chill. The room whispered of mornings spent the same way, yet today the clock face wore a frown of unfamiliar numbers. Each step on the rug seemed to echo twice, though I moved only once, my own shadow fleeting and hesitant. I knew the order of things, knew the rituals by heart, yet the mirror flickered with 3 reflections where there should be 1. The routine was broken, but the pieces fit too perfectly, as if arranged by an unseen hand. The nausea comes in waves now, like it did then. Or was it then? Time has become liquid, pooling in corners of my mind where dust gathers on memories I'm not sure I own. The taste of copper pennies sits heavy on my tongue, though I haven't eaten anything metallic, haven't eaten much of anything, really. Food has lost its appeal since the incident I can't quite name. I remember her hands first, always her hands. They were small, delicate, with bitten nails painted a color that reminded me of dried roses. She had this habit of twisting her ring a thin silver band that caught light in ways that made my eyes water, or maybe my eyes watered for other reasons. The distinction blurs when I try to focus, like looking through rain-streaked glass. The basement stairs creaked in a pattern, 7 steps down, then silence, then 3 more. I counted them obsessively, the way children count sheep or the way prisoners count days. But I wasn't a prisoner, was I? The door wasn't locked. I checked it 17 times that night, or maybe it was 7 times over 17 nights. Numbers have a way of rearranging themselves when you're not paying attention. She said something about the photographs. Her voice carried that particular quality voices have when they're trying to convince you of something you already know is wrong. Honey over broken glass, sweet and cutting. I nodded because nodding seemed safer than speaking, safer than letting the words that lived in my throat escape and take shape in the air between us. The photographs were spread across the table like tarot cards, each one revealing a future I didn't want to see. But they weren't of the future, were they? They were evidence of something that had already happened, something I had witnessed or participated in or dreamed so vividly it became real. The faces in the pictures looked familiar, but in the way that faces in dreams look familiar, you recognize them completely until you wake up and realize you've never seen them before in your life. My reflection in the bathroom mirror splits into fragments when I'm not careful. One face shows exhaustion, dark circles like bruises under eyes that won't focus properly. Another shows something else entirely, a blankness that frightens me more than anger or sadness ever could. The third reflection, the one that shouldn't exist, watches me with an expression I can't read. It knows something I don't, or maybe it knows something I'm pretending not to know. The phone call came while I was washing dishes. The water was too hot, scalding my hands until they turned red, but I couldn't adjust the temperature. My fingers wouldn't work properly, wouldn't grip the handles the way they should. The voice on the other end spoke in measured tones, clinical and detached, using words that bounced off my understanding like stones skipping across water. "We need to talk," the voice said, and I agreed, though I wasn't sure why. Talking seemed dangerous, like opening a door you know you should keep locked. But the voice was insistent, and I found myself agreeing to meet at a place I'd never been to before, though somehow I knew exactly how to get there. The drive there exists in my memory as a series of snapshots. Red traffic light, my hands gripping the steering wheel, a dog running across the street, or maybe it was a child. The distinction seemed important at the time, but now it's just another detail that refuses to stay in focus. The radio played a song I recognized but couldn't name, something about forgiveness or forgetting. The words blended together until they became white noise, static filling the empty spaces in my head. She was waiting for me in the corner booth, the one with the ripped vinyl seat that caught at your clothes when you tried to slide out. Her coffee had gone cold, I could tell from the way the cream had formed a skin on top. She didn't look at me when I sat down, just stared at her hands folded on the table. Those same small hands with the bitten nails and the silver ring that caught light. "You remember what happened," she said, and it wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in certainty, delivered in that honey-over-glass voice that made my skin crawl. I wanted to deny it, wanted to tell her that my memory was full of holes, that I couldn't be sure of anything anymore, but the words stuck in my throat like fish bones. The thing about memory is that it's unreliable even when it's accurate. I remember the weight of something in my hands, something heavier than it should have been for its size. I remember the sound it made when it hit the ground, a dull thud that seemed to echo longer than physics would allow. But I can't remember what it was, this heavy thing, or why I was holding it in the first place. There was blood, I think, or maybe it was paint. Red, certainly, and wet, spreading across surfaces in patterns that reminded me of abstract art. The kind of art that makes you uncomfortable without knowing why, that suggests shapes and forms your mind doesn't want to recognize. I tried to clean it up, I remember that much. Tried to make it disappear before anyone could see, before anyone could ask questions I didn't know how to answer. The detective had kind eyes, the sort that made you want to confess things you hadn't done just to ease the burden of his sympathy. He sat across from me in a room that smelled like disinfectant and fear, asking questions in a voice so gentle it made my chest ache. I wanted to help him, wanted to give him the answers he needed, but every time I tried to speak, the words came out wrong, twisted into shapes that didn't match what I meant to say. "Tell me about that night," he said, and I tried. God, how I tried. But the night in question had broken apart in my memory, scattered like puzzle pieces across a floor. I could see individual moments, the way light fell through a window, the sound of footsteps on gravel, the taste of fear sharp and metallic in my mouth, but I couldn't connect them into a coherent sequence. The worst part was the certainty that I was forgetting something important, something that would make sense of all the fragments. It sat at the edge of my consciousness like a word on the tip of my tongue, always just out of reach. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, convinced that I had remembered, only to find the knowledge slipping away like water through my fingers. She called me again after the interview. Her voice sounded different over the phone, smaller somehow, more fragile. She wanted to meet again, she said. There were things we needed to discuss, things that couldn't be said over the phone. I agreed, though every instinct I had left was screaming at me to hang up, to change my number, to disappear entirely. This time we met at her apartment, a small space filled with plants that seemed to watch me with their broad leaves and knowing silence. She made tea that tasted like earth and regret, serving it in cups that didn't match. Her hands shook slightly as she poured, and I noticed that the silver ring was gone. The pale band of skin where it had been looked naked, vulnerable. "I've been thinking about what really happened," she said, settling into the chair across from me. The afternoon light streaming through her windows turned her face into a map of shadows, highlighting features I hadn't noticed before, or maybe they were features that hadn't been there before. Memory has a way of changing faces, adding details that were never there, erasing others that were. What really happened, the phrase lodged itself in my brain like a splinter, irritating and impossible to ignore. What really happened implied that there was a truth to be discovered, a single correct version of events waiting to be uncovered. But I was beginning to suspect that reality was more fluid than that, more susceptible to interpretation and revision. I remembered a door opening, though I couldn't say which door or who had opened it. I remembered the smell of rain, though the weather had been clear. I remembered running, my feet pounding against pavement that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, though I had no memory of where I was running from or what I was running toward. The photographs appeared again, spread across her coffee table like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was attending. But these weren't the same photographs from before, were they? The faces were different, or maybe they were the same faces from different angles, different moments. The lighting was wrong, too harsh in some places, too soft in others, as if someone had been experimenting with exposure settings. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a picture I didn't want to see. But I looked anyway, drawn by the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The image showed something I recognized but couldn't name, a scene that felt familiar in the way that nightmares feel familiar, not because you've experienced them, but because they tap into fears you didn't know you had. My hands began to shake, and I had to set down the teacup before I dropped it. The trembling started in my fingers and spread up my arms, a physical manifestation of something breaking apart inside me. I tried to speak, to ask her where she had gotten these pictures, but my voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "You were there," she said, and again it wasn't a question. "You saw what happened. You were part of it." Part of it, the words echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull like trapped birds. Part of what I wanted to ask, but I was afraid of the answer. Some questions are dangerous to ask because they force you to confront truths you're not ready to face. The room began to feel smaller, the walls pressing in like a slowly closing fist. The plants seemed to lean toward me, their leaves rustling though there was no breeze. I stood up too quickly, my vision blurring at the edges, and stumbled toward the door. But the door seemed farther away than it should have been, as if the apartment was stretching itself, trying to keep me trapped inside. "You can't run from this forever," she called after me, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted and strange. I fumbled with the doorknob, my hands still shaking, and finally managed to get it open. The hallway beyond was dimmer than I remembered, the fluorescent lights flickering in an irregular rhythm that made shadows dance on the walls. I drove home in a state that wasn't quite panic but wasn't calm either. The streets looked different, unfamiliar, as if someone had rearranged them while I wasn't paying attention. I found myself taking turns I didn't remember deciding to make, following a route that seemed to know where it was going even though I didn't. The house was dark when I arrived, though I couldn't remember leaving it that way. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers brushing against the cold metal that felt no chill. The familiar routine of coming home felt foreign, as if I was performing actions that belonged to someone else's life. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and looked up to find 3 reflections staring back at me. One showed fear, wide-eyed and pale. Another showed confusion, brow furrowed in concentration. The third showed something else entirely, something I didn't want to acknowledge or name. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, then opened them again. Still 3 reflections, but now they were slightly out of sync, moving a fraction of a second after I moved, like a video with bad lag. I reached out to touch the mirror, and all 3 reflections reached back, but only one of them made contact with the glass. The phone rang while I was standing there, frozen in front of the mirror. I let it ring, afraid to answer, afraid of what voice might be on the other end. But it kept ringing, persistent and demanding, until I finally gave in and picked up the receiver. "We found something," the detective's voice said, kind but serious. "Can you come down to the station? There are some things we need to discuss." I agreed because I didn't know how to refuse, because the weight of whatever they had found was already pressing down on me before I even knew what it was. I hung up the phone and looked back at the mirror, but now there was only one reflection, and it looked more frightened than I felt ready to admit. The drive to the station passed in a blur of streetlights and empty intersections. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me, but there was only darkness and the occasional flash of headlights from other cars whose occupants were probably heading home to normal lives with normal problems. The detective was waiting for me in the same room as before, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an electricity that made my skin prickle. On the table between us was a manila envelope, thick with whatever evidence they had discovered. "We found these in a storage unit," he said, sliding the envelope across the table. "The unit was rented under a name we traced back to you. Do you want to tell me about them?" I stared at the envelope without opening it, afraid of what I might find inside. My name on a rental agreement I didn't remember signing. More photographs, perhaps, or documents that would prove my involvement in something I couldn't remember doing. The weight of unknown guilt pressed down on me like a physical thing. "I don't remember renting any storage unit," I said, and it was the truth, or at least the closest thing to truth I could manage. The detective nodded, his kind eyes studying my face for signs of deception he wouldn't find because I was deceiving myself as much as anyone else. Memory can be a tricky thing, he said gently. Trauma has a way of hiding things from us, protecting us from truths we're not ready to handle. But sometimes those truths find their way back to the surface. I opened the envelope with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. Inside were more photographs, but these were different from the ones she had shown me. These were clearer, more focused, showing scenes I recognized but couldn't place. And in several of them, barely visible in the background, was a figure that looked disturbingly like me. The face was turned away, partially obscured by shadow, but the posture was familiar, the way the shoulders slumped, the particular angle of the head. It was me, but it was also not me, as if someone had taken my image and twisted it into something I didn't want to recognize. "Where did you say these came from?" I asked, though I had heard him the first time. "A storage unit downtown. Unit number 47. The rental agreement has your signature on it, though it's dated from a time you claim to have no memory of." Claim to have no memory of. The phrase suggested that my memory loss was voluntary, a choice rather than a symptom. But I couldn't choose to remember any more than I could choose to forget. Memory operated by its own rules, revealing and concealing according to logic I didn't understand. I studied the photographs more carefully, looking for details that might trigger recognition. In one, I could see part of a license plate, though not enough to identify the vehicle. In another, there was a street sign, but the angle made it impossible to read. Everything was almost clear, almost identifiable, like looking at the world through frosted glass. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally, and the detective nodded, though I could see disappointment in his kind eyes. He had been hoping for a breakthrough, a moment of clarity that would make sense of whatever investigation he was conducting. Instead, he got more questions, more uncertainty. "Take all the time you need," he said, but we both knew that time wasn't going to solve this problem. Time had already had its chance, and it had chosen to obscure rather than illuminate. I drove home through streets that seemed to rearrange themselves with each turn, following a route that felt both familiar and foreign. The photograph sat on the passenger seat beside me, their weight seeming to shift the car's balance, making it pull slightly to the right. At home, I spread the pictures across my kitchen table, arranging them in different orders, looking for patterns or connections that might unlock whatever truth they contained. But the harder I looked, the more they seemed to resist interpretation, as if they were deliberately withholding their secrets. The phone rang again, but this time I didn't answer. I couldn't handle another conversation, another voice asking me to remember things I wasn't sure I wanted to remember. The answering machine picked up, and I heard her voice, small and distant through the speaker. "I know you're there," she said. "We need to finish this conversation. There are things you need to know, things about that night that you're not remembering correctly." That night, everyone kept referring to that night as if there was only one night that mattered, one specific sequence of events that held the key to everything else. But my nights had blended together into an indistinguishable mass, each one carrying the same weight of unspecified guilt. I looked at my reflection in the window, backlit by the kitchen lights, and saw only one image staring back. But it was the wrong image, the one that knew things I didn't, the one that had been present for events I couldn't recall. It smiled at me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The photographs began to move in my peripheral vision, shifting positions when I wasn't looking directly at them. Or maybe it was my eyes playing tricks, the result of staring too long at images that didn't want to be seen. I gathered them up and put them back in the envelope, but I could still feel their presence, their weight of unspoken accusations. In the bathroom, I brushed my teeth with mechanical precision, going through the motions of normal life while my mind churned with questions that had no answers. The mirror showed 3 reflections again, but now they were having a conversation I couldn't hear, their mouths moving in silent synchronization. I went to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, I lay in the darkness listening to sounds that might have been the house settling or might have been footsteps in rooms I knew were empty. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of images that could have been memories or could have been dreams, hands reaching for something just out of frame, voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out, shadows moving in patterns that suggested intentions I didn't want to understand. Morning came without resolution, another day beginning with the same questions that had ended the previous night. I made coffee with hands that remembered the routine even though my mind was elsewhere, occupied with fragments of thoughts that wouldn't coalesce into coherent understanding. The newspaper lay on my doorstep, folded neatly and held down by the weight of ordinary concerns. But when I opened it, the headlines seemed to rearrange themselves, forming words that had nothing to do with current events and everything to do with the investigation that was slowly consuming my life. I called in sick to work, though I wasn't sure what kind of sickness I was claiming to have. The kind that makes you forget who you are, the kind that turns mirrors into portals and photographs into accusations. My supervisor's voice was understanding, professionally sympathetic, and I wondered what my absence would mean to people who knew me as someone reliable, someone who showed up and did the job without complications. The storage unit was across town, in a part of the city I rarely visited. I drove there without consciously deciding to, following directions my hands seemed to know even though my mind didn't remember programming them. The facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, the kind of place where people stored things they didn't want to think about. Unit 47 was in the back row, painted the same industrial beige as all the others but somehow distinct, marked by insignificance I could feel but not name. The lock was a combination type, and I found myself entering numbers without knowing where they came from. 4 digits that my fingers remembered even though my brain didn't. The door rolled up with a metallic screech that seemed too loud for the quiet afternoon. Inside was a space about the size of a walk-in closet, filled with boxes and furniture I didn't recognize. But I must have recognized them once, must have carefully arranged these items and paid monthly fees to keep them safe from something. The boxes were labeled in handwriting that looked like mine but seemed to belong to someone else. Personal effects, documents, evidence. That last label made my stomach clench, though I couldn't say why. Evidence of what? And why would I have collected it, preserved it, hidden it away in this anonymous space? I opened the box marked evidence with hands that shook slightly, as if they knew what they would find before my conscious mind caught up. Inside were more photographs, but these were different from the ones the detective had shown me. These were personal, intimate, showing moments that felt private even though I couldn't remember experiencing them. There was also a journal bound in black leather and filled with handwriting I recognized as my own, but the words on the pages described events I had no memory of, thoughts and feelings that seemed to belong to someone else. The entries were dated, providing a timeline for a period of my life that existed in my memory as a blank space. I read my own words describing actions I couldn't remember taking, emotions I couldn't remember feeling. The person who had written these entries was methodical, careful, documenting everything with the precision of someone who knew they might need to refer back to these records later. But why? What had happened that required such careful documentation? The final entry was different from the others, written in handwriting that was shakier, more urgent. "I can't remember anymore," it said. "The memories are fading, or maybe I'm making them fade. She says I have to remember, but I don't think I want to. Some things are better left buried." She says I have to remember. The same woman who had been calling me, showing me photographs, insisting that I was part of something I couldn't recall. But what was her connection to all of this? What role had she played in whatever events had led to this storage unit, this collection of evidence for crimes I couldn't remember committing? I closed the journal and put it back in the box, but I could feel its weight even when I wasn't touching it. The truth was in there somewhere, waiting to be discovered, but I wasn't sure I had the courage to face it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The drive home was a blur of stop signs and traffic lights, ordinary intersections that seemed charged with significance I couldn't decode. Every turn felt like a decision, every straight stretch like a delay of some inevitable reckoning. The journal sat on the passenger seat beside me, its presence as heavy as a passenger I couldn't see. At home, I sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of me, reading my own words like a stranger's confession. The person who had written these entries was someone I might have been, or might still be, or might become again if the right triggers aligned. The boundaries between past and present, between memory and imagination, seemed to dissolve with each page I turned. According to my own handwriting, I had been involved in something that required careful planning and precise execution. There were references to meetings, to preparations, to a final night when everything would come together. But the details were vague, written in a kind of code that assumed the reader would already know what was being discussed. The phone rang, startling me out of my reading. This time I answered, though I wasn't sure why. "Did you find it?" her voice asked, and I knew immediately what she meant. "Yes," I said, because denial seemed pointless now. "Then you know we need to talk, really talk this time, not just dance around the edges like we've been doing." I agreed to meet her one more time, though I suspected this conversation would be different from the others. The weight of the journal, of the photographs, of all the evidence I had apparently collected and then forgotten, would change the dynamic between us. I was no longer the confused victim of memory loss. I was something else entirely, though I wasn't sure what. She was waiting for me in the same diner where we had met before, but she looked different somehow. Older, maybe, or just more tired. The silver ring was back on her finger, catching light from the fluorescent fixtures overhead. "You remember now," she said when I sat down, and this time it really wasn't a question. "I remember some things," I said carefully, "but not everything, not the important parts." "The important parts are the ones you chose to forget," she said. "The mind has ways of protecting itself from truths that are too difficult to bear." Chose to forget, the phrase implied agency, control over the process of memory and forgetting. But if I had chosen to forget, why had I also chosen to preserve evidence? Why create a record of events I didn't want to remember? "Tell me what really happened," I said, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face for something she apparently didn't find. "You were there," she said finally. "You were part of it, but you weren't the only one. There were others, people who made decisions that affected all of us." Others, the word opened up possibilities I hadn't considered, suggested a larger conspiracy or collaboration that extended beyond whatever role I had played. but it also suggested shared responsibility, a distribution of guilt that might make my own participation more bearable. "What was my part in it?" I asked. "You were the one who documented everything," she said. "You insisted on keeping records, taking photographs, preserving evidence. You said it was for protection, in case anyone tried to blame us for things that weren't our fault." Documentation, photography, evidence. The words aligned with what I had found in the storage unit, confirming a role that felt both familiar and foreign. I could imagine myself being methodical, careful, thinking ahead to potential consequences, but I couldn't imagine what events had required such careful documentation. "And now," I asked, "now they want to tie everything to story 10. The silent hour." It wasn't unusual for the clock to skip a beat. The ticking blended into the hum of the house, a part of the background that whispered through the air. I noticed its silence the second time around, but only in passing, like a flicker of streetlight in the corner of your eye. The hall was tidy, everything aligned as it should be. Dust gathered politely in corners, undisturbing. There was a mark on the wall that caught my eye, a slight smudge, easily overlooked. I left it alone. The clock sat quietly, hands stalled at arbitrary numbers. I didn't wind it. It seemed content to rest in its quiet. The call came while I was sorting through papers in the kitchen. My sister's voice carried that particular strain I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant something had shifted in ways we couldn't yet name. She spoke carefully, measuring each word like ingredients in a recipe she'd never tried before. "The neighbors haven't seen her in days," she said. "The mail is piling up." I set down the stack of bills I'd been organizing. Through the window, I could see the afternoon settling into that golden hour that makes everything look deceptively peaceful. My sister continued talking, but her words seemed to float around the edges of my attention. I found myself focusing instead on the way the light caught the dust motes dancing above the kitchen table. "Are you listening?" she asked. "Yes," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I'd agreed to. The drive over felt longer than usual. Traffic moved with that peculiar sluggishness that seems to accompany moments when urgency and helplessness collide. I kept my hand steady on the wheel, but my mind wandered to the last conversation I'd had with our aunt. She'd seemed distracted, her usual sharp focus scattered across topics that didn't quite connect. At the time, I'd attributed it to age, to the natural drift that comes with accumulated years. Her house sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by the kind of mature trees that cast deep shadows even on bright days. The mailbox overflowed exactly as my sister had described, envelopes and catalogs creating a small avalanche when I lifted the metal flap. The silence around the property felt thick, almost tangible. I used the key she'd given me years ago, the one meant for emergencies. The lock turned easily, but the door seemed heavier than I remembered. Inside, the air carried a staleness that spoke of closed windows and undisturbed routines. Everything appeared normal at first glance. The living room maintained its familiar arrangement, photographs still smiling from their frames, books still lined up on shelves with military precision. But something felt displaced, like a song played in the wrong key. I called her name, though I expected no answer. My voice echoed strangely in the space, as if the house had forgotten how to absorb sound properly. I moved through the rooms methodically, noting details without yet understanding their significance. In the kitchen, a coffee cup sat on the counter, clean and dry. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical song, but when I opened it, I found food in various stages of decay. The smell hit me then, not the sharp assault of obvious decomposition, but something subtler. a sweetness that didn't belong, mixed with the musty scent of neglect. I followed it upstairs, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet she'd installed years ago to muffle the sounds of her restless nights. Her bedroom door stood ajar. I pushed it open with 2 fingers, suddenly reluctant to leave fingerprints on surfaces that might matter to someone else later. The bed was made, corners tucked with the precision she'd maintained since her military days. But the covers looked wrong somehow, too smooth, too perfect, as if they'd been arranged by someone who understood the mechanics of bed making, but not the subtle imperfections that come from actual sleep. I found her in the bathroom, and the discovery felt both shocking and inevitable. She lay in the bathtub, fully clothed, her face peaceful in a way that seemed almost theatrical. The water had long since drained away, leaving only stains on the porcelain and the lingering scent I detected downstairs. The rational part of my mind immediately began cataloging details for the authorities, but another part, a deeper instinct, whispered that something about the scene felt constructed, deliberate in ways that natural death rarely achieves. Her clothes showed no signs of struggle, no water damage that would suggest she'd drowned. Her hands rested at her sides with an almost ceremonial positioning. I backed away from the bathroom and called the police from the hallway, my voice surprisingly steady as I reported what I'd found. They arrived with the efficient bustle of people accustomed to such discoveries, their questions following predictable patterns. Had she been depressed? Did she have health problems? When had I last spoken with her? I answered honestly, but each response felt inadequate, failing to capture the growing certainty that this scene had been arranged by someone who understood her habits, her routines, her vulnerabilities. The detective assigned to the case was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and careful questions. She moved through the house with practiced attention, noting details I'd missed or dismissed. When she asked about my aunt's social circle, I realized how little I actually knew about her daily life. She was private, I explained, independent. She didn't like to burden people with her problems. The detective nodded, making notes in a small pad. Any recent changes in behavior, new people in her life, financial difficulties. I found myself struggling to provide concrete answers. My aunt had always maintained a careful distance from family concerns, sharing only what she deemed necessary. Our conversations had followed comfortable patterns, touching on weather, local news, and shared memories, but rarely venturing into the territories where problems might hide. Over the following days, I found myself returning to her house, ostensibly to help with arrangements, but really to search for clues that might explain the growing unease in my chest. The police had released the scene after their initial investigation, concluding that while the circumstances were unusual, they found no clear evidence of foul play. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. I began going through her papers more systematically, looking for patterns or anomalies. Her financial records showed regular deposits and withdrawals, nothing unusual except for a series of cash withdrawals in the weeks before her death. The amounts weren't large, but they represented a departure from her typical spending habits. In her bedroom closet, I found a shoebox tucked behind winter coats. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in her careful handwriting but never sent. They were addressed to people I didn't recognize, filled with apologies for unnamed transgressions and promises to make amends for unspecified wrongs. One letter, longer than the others, caught my attention. In it, she wrote about feeling watched, about sensing that someone was keeping track of her movements. She described a growing paranoia that she recognized as possibly irrational but couldn't dismiss. The letter was dated just weeks before her death. I took the letters to the detective, who read them with professional interest but little apparent alarm. Elderly people sometimes develop anxiety disorders, she explained. Social isolation can exacerbate feelings of persecution. Without concrete evidence of threats or harassment, these letters support the theory that she was struggling with mental health issues. But the detective agreed to look deeper into my aunt's final weeks, interviewing neighbors and checking security cameras in the area. What emerged was a picture of a woman whose routines had indeed changed in subtle ways. The neighbor across the street mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the house at odd hours. The postal worker noted that my aunt had seemed nervous during their brief interactions, asking unusual questions about mail security and delivery schedules. Most intriguingly, the manager at her bank remembered her coming in repeatedly to ask about her account activity, expressing concerns about unauthorized access that the bank's records didn't support. These details created a pattern that felt significant but remained frustratingly incomplete. Each piece of information raised new questions without providing clear answers. I found myself drawn deeper into an investigation that felt increasingly personal, driven by a need to understand not just what had happened to my aunt, but what she had been experiencing in her final weeks. I began visiting places she had frequented, talking to people who had known her casually. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had become increasingly isolated and anxious, but also of someone who had been trying to reach out in ways that others had missed or dismissed. The librarian at her local branch mentioned that my aunt had been researching topics related to personal safety and legal procedures for reporting harassment. The pharmacist noted that she had asked questions about medications that weren't among her prescriptions, specifically drugs that could cause confusion or memory loss. These conversations left me with the uncomfortable realization that my aunt might have been trying to tell someone about a very real threat, but her concerns had been filtered through assumptions about age and mental decline that prevented people from taking her seriously. The breakthrough came when I found her computer password hidden in a book of poetry she'd kept by her bedside. Her email account revealed a correspondence I hadn't known existed, a series of increasingly desperate messages to a legal aid organization about a situation she described only in vague terms. In these emails, she wrote about someone who had gained access to her personal information and was using it to manipulate her daily life in subtle ways. She described feeling like a prisoner in her own home, afraid to leave because someone always seemed to know where she was going and when she would return. The legal aid organization had responded with form letters suggesting she contact local police, advice she had apparently been reluctant to follow because she had no concrete proof of the harassment she was experiencing. Armed with this new information, I convinced the detective to reopen the investigation. What they found, buried in phone records and financial databases, was evidence of a sophisticated stalking operation. Someone had indeed been monitoring my aunt's activities, using publicly available information and social engineering to create the impression of omniscient surveillance. The perpetrator turned out to be someone from her distant past, a former colleague who had harbored decades-old grievances and had recently discovered how easy it was to torment someone from a distance using modern technology and psychological manipulation. But even with this revelation, questions remained. The harassment explained my aunt's anxiety and paranoia, but it didn't clearly explain her death. The medical examiner found evidence of prescription medications in her system, but not in lethal quantities. The positioning of her body in the bathtub remained unexplained, as did the timing of her death in relation to the escalating harassment. The case officially remains open, though active investigation has ceased. The stalker was prosecuted for harassment, but couldn't be definitively linked to my aunt's death. The official cause remains undetermined, suspended somewhere between suicide, accidental death, and homicide. I still visit her house sometimes, now empty and waiting for a state resolution. I sit in her living room and listen to the silence, trying to understand what she experienced in her final days. The clock on the mantel still doesn't work, its hands frozen at numbers that no longer seem arbitrary but somehow significant, marking a moment when everything changed and nothing was ever quite the same. The truth, I've come to realize, might be something I'm not prepared to fully accept. Sometimes the most disturbing crimes are the ones that leave us questioning not just what happened, but whether we truly want to know.